Hey, Catherine, I just wanted to check and see if you wanted to do a mic check, make sure we can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me, Stephen?
Yep, you sound good.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the October Mid-Atlantic Council meeting. Get started with our first agenda item, Northeast Fisheries Science Center Federal Surveys. We're going to be getting a presentation by Dr. Catherine Ford and Peter Chase. Catherine, whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks. Chairman Townsend. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you sound fine.
Great. And is there a slide deck up that says Northeast Fisheries Science Center Fishery Independent Surveys? Oh, great. I can see it now. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Catherine Ford. I'm the Population Ecosystem Monitoring and Analysis Division Chief at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Inside of PMAD, we have three branches this week now. The Ecosystem Surveys branch is run by Pete Chase, and he'll be giving part of this presentation with me. We also have the Population Biology branch, which is run by Dr. Rich McBride, and you'll be hearing from some of his group later today. Rich's group includes the Age and Growth team, Maturity team, and they do food web work. They also include the shark team. So it's a pretty interesting branch that he runs. And then this week, the Offshore Wind Ecology branch led by Andy Lipsky joined us in PMAD. So we're looking forward to welcoming that team and doing more work around offshore wind. So I do want to give a quick thanks. This presentation came together from a large group of people. You can see there lots of conversations over the past several years, in fact. And before I go any further, I want to give a quick shout out to Hannah Hart. She's our Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council coordinator on the Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel. She's done a great job of keeping us moving forward with NTAP and getting some really good products out of that group. So that's really exciting. So thank you all for inviting us here, and really happy to tell you some more about our fishery independent surveys. Next slide. So we're going to do a quick overview of some of the decisions regarding our surveys and some of the major things we need to keep in mind when we're planning surveys and considering contingency plans. Then I'm going to give you an overview of our whole fishery independent survey enterprise at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Go into a fair bit of detail about the multi-species bottom trawl survey and our spring performance on the Piccolo. Then Pete Chase is going to take over and give an overview of the scallop survey and the spring 2023 challenges we had with that survey. And we should have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So next slide, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Hare to talk about some of the decisions that we make.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ford. Next slide, please. Yeah, so our intent at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center as we look forward with surveys is to really develop multiple options for mitigating the effect of wind energy development on our surveys, and multiple options for building resiliency for our fishery independent surveys in the Northeast to accommodate both short-term and medium-term disruptions. In developing these multiple options, we will work collaboratively with partners and stakeholders. We will work adaptively to develop sort of long-term options, and then we'll take action to meet needs, as quickly as possible when available. Next slide, please. And just to kind of walk through some of the elements to decisions that we're going to need to make regarding the future of our survey, regarding these multiple options that we're looking to develop. First and foremost is the scientific value. The data collected can be used in regional stock assessments and/or fisheries management. Another component of these decisions is funding and the funding mechanism. Are we talking about current funding? Are we talking about additional or new funding? If new funding, who is it from and what direction is provided? And then from a Northeast Fisheries Science Center perspective, are we anticipating supporting these multiple options with contracts, with grants, Northeast Fisheries Science Center funds, OMAO funds, or other? Another component is personnel, who will support these survey activities. A fourth component are data management considerations. It's one thing to collect data It's another thing to store data, manage data, and make data available. So we need to think about the data management considerations. There's also the long-term viability of the platform, funding, and personnel. The value of fishery independent surveys comes from the time series of standardized data collection. So this, long-term viability is an important piece of decision making. The other piece is flexibility. What is the short-term reactiveness of a given option? Can we turn it over? Can we turn it on in a day? Does it take a month to turn on? Does it take a year to turn on? Does it take 5 years to turn on? What's the flexibility or the reactiveness of the option? There is a question as to whether calibration is needed or not as we develop these multiple options. If we're calibrating to, for example, the Bigelow series, we're talking about an option that supplements the Bigelow series. If we're talking about a new survey that's not calibrated, we're talking about a survey that's complementary to, for example, the Bigelow survey. And then for all of our surveys, we have the permitting and protected species concerns. So as we sort of move forward in developing these multiple options, these are the list of the decisions that we need to make, the elements of those decisions that we've sort of classified thus far. If there's things missing from this list that you think should be there, please, by all means, let us know. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Catherine. Next slide, please.
Thanks, John. So I wanted to give folks a brief overview of our whole fishery independent survey enterprise at the Science Center. We do 14 surveys that span our 4 Science Center divisions, science divisions. These include our surf clam ocean quahog survey. Coast span is a shark pupping and nursery survey. We have a scallop survey. Our northern shrimp survey is also known as the Gulf of Maine ecosystem survey. That's done in the summertime in the Gulf of Maine. The multi-species bottom trawl survey, shark bottom longline survey. Our cooperative bottom longline survey is done in the Gulf of Maine. We also run a continuous plankton recorder survey. We have the EcoMon biological oceanography cruises. And then there are several marine mammal and protected species surveys that we also conduct. Next slide. The ones that I'll be really keeping in mind during the rest of this conversation is the fishery independent surveys focused on groundfish and shellfish. These surveys use gear and deployment protocols that are different than commercial fishing practices. And the reason we do this is because we're really trying to be standardized, and we're trying to represent a variety of scientific questions that might be asked by these individual surveys. So for example, we often use a smaller mesh size specifically to catch smaller fish because we're looking over the whole life history of a fish. We also sample areas that people often call areas with quote unquote no fish. We haven't found areas with no fish at all, but there are areas that we sample because we're looking at the entire potential population area or habitat area of a given stock. So oftentimes we're sampling over many years in a variety of areas that have lower densities of certain species, and that's expected. Our goal is continuity from year to year. The reason we want to be so standard with our protocols is that so we can be sure that our changes in catch are not attributable to a change in method. So you could imagine that if we changed the net every season, you'd wonder if we changed our if the catch results were different, if it was just because we changed the net. So we make sure that we follow standard protocols so we can make sure that we can understand the data more holistically. We use a variety of platforms. We use commercial fishing vessels on the cooperative bottom longline survey and on the surf clam ocean quahog survey. We use contract research vessels. We've used the Sharp on the scallop survey. That's a UNOLS vessel. On the Gulf of Maine shrimp survey, the Science Center's Gloria Michelle vessel has been used. And we also use a NOAA White ship. That's a ship run by the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations in NOAA. And that's the multi-species bottom trawl survey run on the Bigelow. Next slide. So a quick note on NOAA white ships. This is pretty relevant in terms of understanding some of the decision making and how it's done. We're in the Department of Commerce in NOAA. NOAA is one of the agencies within the Department of Commerce. Inside of NOAA, there are several line offices. The National Marine Fisheries Service is one of them. Inside of the National Marine Fisheries Service is our Science Center, Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and GARFO, our regional office. Each region of the country has a science center and a regional office. Another line office inside of NOAA is the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, and they run ships and planes to support the other line offices within NOAA. So everything from the Weather Service to OAR, National Ocean Service, National Marine Fisheries Service. So it's important to understand that structure because it affects communication, budgeting, and decision-making around the surveys that are done on white ships or airplanes. Next slide, please. A question I get asked a fair bit is how much do these surveys cost? And again, this does have a lot of implication for how we do our planning and budgeting. So here I have a spreadsheet with some of the fishery independent surveys that we do. They're listed on the left. Then I have our staff costs. That's our full-time employees. Those are the folks that work full-time for the Science Center running these surveys. Then I have vessel costs. These are based on our fiscal year 2023. We just exited fiscal year 2023. So these are approximate costs from the past year. Our operating costs are things that are like contractors that we hire to help out with surveys, any overtime costs, equipment, repairs, travel. Oftentimes we have to travel to get to wherever vessels are staging, and any expendable costs associated with a survey, and then the total of the survey. I'll explain the notes column in a second. So for the fall bottom trawl survey, that's a 60-day survey. It's done in concert with the spring bottom trawl survey, a 60-day survey. And together those surveys cost $826,000. I have vessel costs as not applicable here because OMAO gives us sea days. We don't actually pay anything out of our budget for that vessel cost. This survey is usually base funded. So the Northeast Fisheries Science Center covers those costs, the $826,000 per survey for those two surveys. Shrimp is a 21-day survey. You can see the costs there. Total cost is around $377,000. This particular survey doesn't have any base funding. So even though we have staff costs listed here, those are staff. That's how much it costs to pull staff off of other projects to run the shrimp survey. We actually don't have anybody dedicated to this survey right now. With scallop, clam, and Gulf of Maine bottom longline surveys, you can see the costs there. Each of those surveys, we pay for the vessel. We also pay our staff. So we keep those FTEs on for those surveys to run those surveys. But the survey funding itself, those vessel costs and operating costs, we often have to find supplements for. So we're either asking headquarters for survey funding, we're finding underages and other programs to support these surveys. There is not reliable annual funding for those three surveys. And what'll happen if we don't get to the full survey amount is we'll cut sea days. So we, instead of doing a 36-day survey, we cut it back to 32 days, for example, if we don't have the full amount. To give you some idea of how these costs compare to some of the other fishery independent surveys done, the NEMAP survey done by VIMS is about $1.8 million a year. And the Eastern Bering Sea survey, which is done by the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, that's a 36-day survey done on commercial platforms. That cost, including the vessels, is close to $3 million. So you can see that our costs are actually very good costs. They're very low for this type of work, definitely in line with what other areas are spending on these types of surveys. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to, this is my Love Fest slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the multi-species bottom trawl survey. This is an amazing survey. It hit 60 years this fall. The fall survey started in 1963. The map here shows our survey strata. You can see it extends into Canada because this survey predates the Hague Line. It's been done on 2 vessels, the Albatross 4, and most recently it's being done on the Henry B. Bigelow. This survey monitors ecosystem changes and trends in abundance, distribution, and life history, and it focuses on demersal fish. It provides information for 63 stocks and collects more than 600 species. The key products that rely on this data include status of the ecosystem reports, the stock assessments, and our climate assessments. This survey is done over 120 survey days per year. We break it into 2 surveys, the spring and the fall survey, done on the Bigelow, and the Bigelow has a sister ship, the Pisces, also run by OMAO. The trawl gear that's used on this survey was designed by the Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel, and the same trawl gear is used on the VIMS NEOMAP and ChessMap surveys, and there's interest in other regions to start using this particular survey gear. It's a pretty remarkable scientific enterprise. We have, wait, you can go back to the survey slide, thanks. We have 5 full-time biologists and 3 gear technicians dedicated to this survey year-round, so that's a total of 8 staff. But we sail with 15 scientific staff. Often this comes from other divisions within the Science Center. We also sail with contract staff and with volunteers. So if you're really interested in going on a leg, they're about 3 weeks long, and we'd love to have you. And the staff, when they're not sailing, they're supporting a variety of research efforts, everything from taxonomic studies to catch efficiency studies to some redesign efforts for the survey itself. So this type of survey, for everybody's awareness, I think you know this already, it's very sensitive to changes in the platform and any gear types. So standardization is very important on this survey. And I would argue that it's not perfect for everything. No scientific survey is, but it's extremely valuable, and we should do everything we can to keep this going for sure. It's also been requested in more than 6 different strategic plans across NOAA and the region to continue this time series. So it's really valuable well beyond the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Okay, next slide now. So that said, that's my real pitch for the Bigelow survey. I think it's fantastic, but performance in the last few years hasn't been that great. And we're very worried about that. The first 8 years were excellent. What I have here on the top right is the number of valid tows for the trawl surveys. So the spring is the green line that's a solid line on this graph, and the fall survey is the dotted orange line. Over the history of using the Bigelow started in 2009. We've had 29 surveys. We usually sample around 350 stations. That's considered a pretty normal survey season. So what I did was I pulled out the years where we had less than 300 stations. That's a third of the time series now, which is quite a lot. And the reasons for those problems, the lack of sampling in those years, was because of late spring starts. And what I mean by that is in the wintertime, the Bigelow goes into dry dock for repairs and has been coming out of that repair period late on a regular basis. We've also had 3 seasons affected by COVID. We've had 2 seasons affected by vessel staffing limitations. So OMAO handles the vessel staffing, vessel operations, and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center handles the science staffing, those 15 science staff that go out. So we've had 2 seasons with vessel staffing limitations, and we've had 2 seasons with in-season ship repairs needed. So during the survey, there was some sort of a breakdown that needed repair. In one case, we used the Pisces. The Pisces was brought up to finish the season, which was a great use of the Pisces. Next slide. So this spring, we started May 8th. We usually aim to start at the beginning of March. So it was a dramatically late start, very disappointing. We did 12-hour daytime ops when we were out there. Usually we do 24-hour operations. We were able to complete 70 of 377 stations, and we focused on Georges Bank. So on the right-hand side of the slide, the map here, the green strata are the ones that we completed. The orange stratum is one that was only partially sampled. The reason that we had delays were due to vessel mechanical issues as well as vessel staffing shortages. And it was a challenging spring in that it wasn't really clear when the vessel would be available. So there were last minute changes in the start date. So we had science staff ready to go whenever the vessel was ready to go. And we did discover that the backup plan, the Pisces, wasn't ready. So we're looking into that now. I'll explain in a second. Next slide. A question I get a lot is, so what's the impact on assessments? And I have a rather unsatisfying answer here, which is it's hard to answer that question. So what I have on this slide is a conceptual model here of increasing uncertainty. So along the x-axis is the timeline. This is totally conceptual. This is not any particular stock. So we have a timeline along the x-axis, biomass on the y-axis. The abundance estimate is the blue line. The uncertainty around that estimate is the gray shaded area. And then the catch advice, again, theoretical, conceptual here, is the orange line. So one could say that as uncertainty increases, your catch advice ultimately responds by being more precautionary and going down and getting less connected to the actual abundance estimate. That does happen. It's not the only thing that happens. In the way the assessments bring in the abundance estimate from the trawl survey includes other data sets as these assessments are being built. So the index that is built with the fishery independent survey that we do is only one piece of the pie that goes into the whole assessment framework. So there can be situations in which, even in an increasing uncertainty situation, the assessment makes simplifying assumptions that ends up increasing catch advice in the long run. But it's a long way of saying this is a complicated question to answer. So each of the stock assessments in their management and research tracks are going to have to determine how to use the survey data from the last few years. And the Northeast Regional Coordinating Council is interested in exploring this question as well. So there will be more information to come with that. Next slide. Another question I get a lot is, you didn't do much survey work, so do you have any money left over? So our typical cost of the spring survey is $250,000. This year it cost us $181,000 because we expended all of our normal costs leading up to the survey, getting ready for it. And then we needed to hold people in hotels. The ship leaves from Norfolk, so they were in Norfolk waiting to sail. Really the way we go about it is we want the scientists to be ready whenever the ship is ready. So that's how we approached it this spring. And it was a little stressful for staff, but they were ready to go whenever they could. So we had $69,000 left over. And the way we spent that money was to pre-fund some of the contract labor we're going to need in the spring bottom trawl survey this coming spring. So we're in fiscal year 24 right now. The fiscal year 24 spring will start in March. And so we pre-funded some of those expenses. I could go into a lot more detail here, but I won't today. But we do have to make some decisions pretty early for fiscal year 24. So we were making those decisions before the spring 23 survey was even done. So it can get a little complicated. Next slide. So there are a lot of pressures on this survey. In addition to the unintended lost sea days that we've been talking about here, there are several other things that could really impact this survey. I gave this talk for the first time last week at the New England Fishery Management Council. So I added government shutdown onto the slide because we were very worried that if the government shut down, this survey would be off the water this fall. Fortunately, that didn't happen. I'm very glad that Congress planned around our survey and gave us until November 17th to get it done. So for offshore wind, we see that coming as a potential impact to the survey. We're doing survey mitigation activities right now. The Bigelow vessel will not be able to operate inside of offshore wind farms, so we're planning around that. We have a midlife refit planned for October 2027 to September of 2028. During the midlife refit, the Pisces is the backup plan, but that leaves us with just the one vessel because the Bigelow will be out of service then. And then ultimately we have end of life of the Bigelow. We will need to plan for that too. Next slide. So we are busy developing survey solutions. We have several projects underway at different levels. This spans the NOAA hierarchy. So one thing that we're working on, led by Dr. Hare, is a formal agreement with the fisheries, NOAA Fisheries and OMAO, that Pisces will be the primary backup for Bigelow and will be staffed and ready if needed. And making arrangements with other surveys that might be using the Pisces during those times, and being aware of what other backups and contingencies will be needed if this is triggered. At the national level, they're working on developing a survey contingency fund to assist with any additional costs created if any contingency options are needed. They're also working on national survey prioritization for distribution of funds. And at the local level, we're involved in a couple of different projects simulating our survey activities and redesigning the survey model that we're using, and looking at things like optimizing station allocation and adapting to offshore wind. Next slide. For contingency planning, we're documenting those plans that we put in place in the event of the Bigelow not being available. And this summer, the Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel formed a working group to have an ongoing discussion and inform that contingency planning activity. The term of reference for this group is to describe vessel platforms that can support completing the Northeast Fisheries Science Center spring and fall bottom trawl survey when the Bigelow is unavailable, assess the viability of the platforms and platform deployment needs from logistical and scientific perspectives, and identify where additional information is needed to fully develop a given option. Consider options that at a minimum meet stock assessment needs. This effort should produce a relatively high-level overview of options and identify information gaps. Next slide. There are three primary options on the table right now. The Pisces, as I've mentioned. The Northeast Fisheries Science Center right now runs the Gloria Michelle, and the Gloria Michelle is approaching end of life. So replacing it with a research vessel that's a little larger and could do some of the stations that we traditionally do on the Bigelow might be worth looking into. And then an industry-based survey designed with the same gear and sampling design as the bottom trawl survey, with more focused data collection, instead of doing the full span of data collection, really focusing on the data that is needed for stock assessments. And there are two sub options under this option. One is as an as-needed fill-in for Bigelow, and the other is conducted routinely in parallel to Bigelow, so something that goes out every season. We think that in terms of the cold start problem, this might be a better solution, since it'll be really hard to, just suddenly call a boat and have them go out. Then there are several other options that are of interest that need further development. Everything from adding augmenting surveys like our bottom long line survey, to using alternative survey methodologies, and exploring in more detail some of our funding, communication, and staffing challenges. Next slide. So this links back to what Dr. Hare was talking about with elements of decisions. We have to kind of walk through all of these different elements as we build out these options. Next slide. Now I'm already at 30 minutes here. It's 9:30, so I'll go through the next few slides pretty quickly, but I figured there would be some other questions and interest in some of these activities around offshore wind planning. We do have a survey simulation, experimentation, and evaluation project. We're going to be expecting analytical results this winter. Right now, it looks like we're going to have a sort of a science conference, a half-day science conference in January. So you should be hearing about that pretty soon. And that's looking at what happens when we can't sample inside of wind farm areas. That's the real topic for that project. We're also doing survey restratification and station allocation work. This is an internal team that's working on this with assessment biologists. Some of this work was recently presented at the ICES annual science conference in Spain. And then we're also working on survey-specific mitigation plans for all of our fishery independent surveys to determine how they can adapt to offshore wind and what we need to do to adapt them all. So we're in the process of hiring somebody to focus on fully developing those plans. They've all been drafted at this point and building out that whole program. Next slide. So what we're facing right now in the next 12 months or so, we're doing the multi-species bottom trawl survey right now. All things are still progressing well with that survey. Spring of 2023, we don't anticipate any challenges. A shutdown is always a risk. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's not always a risk, but this year we think the shutdown is a risk to the spring survey, depending on when it happens. We don't anticipate any impacts to the fall 2024 survey, but we'll know more as it gets closer to that time frame. In contrast, the Gulf of Maine Ecosystem Shrimp Survey, we're planning on canceling that this summer. We're hoping it's just a suspension. We think that this survey has a lot of value and we do want to fund it in 2025, but we need to hire a chief scientist for this survey and a technician to help run the survey and find additional operational funds to keep it going. Next slide. So this slide and the next slide are actually about the shrimp survey. I'll cover it really quickly. There's more detail in the slide. This survey is really valuable from an ecosystem standpoint, and we think it has some sort of perhaps unappreciated value at this point. So next slide. The bottom line is that the assessment impacts seem to be quite minor because the shrimp stock itself is so low at this point. The technical committee has determined that use of the Bigelow trawl survey could be enough of an index to keep tabs on what the shrimp population is doing and determine if we need a higher resolution survey in the future. And then the rest of the assessments that rely on this survey, it's not core data to those surveys. So there's a general concern about loss of fishery independent surveys, but no specific assessment that relies entirely on this assessment. This decision has been made over the past 12 months with communication with the New England Council and ASMFC. We let the Mid-Atlantic Council know what was going on, and we've also been in touch with the technical committee for shrimp, as well as the population dynamics branch at the Science Center. So sorry to zip through those so quickly. Please feel free to raise any questions later, or I can absolutely talk to anybody offline about what's going on there. But in the interests of time, I do want to pass the torch on to Pete Chase, who will walk us through the scallop survey and how things went this year with the scallop survey. So take it on, Pete.
Thanks, Catherine. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound fine.
Yes.
Great, thanks. So I'd like to start by providing a little background on our scallop survey. Then we'll take a look at survey performance over the past 10 years and, of course, review the challenges that we had in 2023. And then I'll provide an update on what we're planning for our 2024 survey. Next slide, please. The primary objective of the survey is to collect data on the abundance and distribution of sea scallops for use in assessment and management. It is a standardized survey. The dredge portion of the survey has been running annually since 1979. In 2008, the Albatross 4 was decommissioned and the survey transitioned to the Hugh R. Sharp, and HabCam operations were added to the survey in 2009. And since then, we've been conducting both dredge and HabCam operations during our survey. We usually request about 36 days of sampling each year, request the funding for 36 days. The actual number of days we get is dependent on the funding and also vessel availability. And we typically run our survey in May, June. Next slide, please. This slide shows a review of survey performance over the past 10 years, starting in 2014. The bars on the chart represent the number of sea days scheduled aboard the Sharp each year. The blue portion is the number of days actually spent at sea. The red shows the number of planned days that weren't completed for each particular year. The most notable years are described under the chart. So in 2014, we lost 11 sea days due to a propulsion drive issue and bad weather. 2020, of course, was the pandemic, so we didn't sail. 2021, we lost 5 days due to a medical issue with a crew member plus some bad weather. And then in 2023, we lost basically all sea days due to vessel mechanical issues. Next slide, please. This table shows days sampled and days lost for each year, but it also includes the number of dredge tows completed and the nautical miles of HabCam track. The years highlighted in red indicate no data or very little data collected. The yellow highlights marginal production, and green indicates a productive survey. One thing to note here is that in 2014, we lost 11 days due to a propulsion issue, but we were still able to collect a lot of data because we simply had a lot of days on the vessel schedule for that year. So we still spent 24 days at sea. Next slide, please. This graph shows the Sharp daily rate along with the number of sea days scheduled aboard the vessel for each year. So the general trend is pretty clear. It shows fewer days scheduled as the cost per sea day increases. So we would need an annual increase in our budget every year in order to maintain a consistent number of sea days from one year to the next. The Sharp daily rate in 2014 was 12,900, and the Sharp daily rate in 2023 was 19,850. Next slide, please. So as mentioned in one of the previous slides, we did have a number of challenges in 2023. So I'll just review what happened this year. In the spring, we were informed that the Sharp would only be able to provide about 22 sea days to our program due to vessel staffing constraints. So as a backup plan, we secured 9 days of sampling aboard the Bigelow. That was going to occur in late July, and the intention was to use those days for HabCam operations. After staging the Sharp in early May, the vessel encountered power issues that prevented it from sailing. Our scientific staff returned to Woods Hole, and they were waiting on standby for the repairs to be completed. They ended up driving down a couple of times for false starts and coming back. The timeline for repairs was continually extended, and finally we were able to get off the dock for an abbreviated survey on June 14th. But shortly after the sampling began, they experienced significant issues with the vessel's winches. So the ship was forced back into port and it ended our survey. Soon after that, we learned that A-frame issues aboard the Bigelow would prevent us from using towed HabCam during the July cruise dates. So in the end, we did use those sea days on Bigelow for field testing our newly developed HabCam AUV. So in the end, we coordinated with RSA survey partners who were able to cover the areas that we were unable to sample this year. And our assessment scientist had access to both dredge and optical data from all areas. And again, we'd like to thank VIMS and CFF for all their efforts this field season. Next slide, please. So obviously we want to do whatever we can to better position ourselves for next year's survey. So we're looking to make some operational changes for 2024. The Sharp has not sailed since our survey ended. We've heard that the power issues have been resolved and the ship could leave the dock, but the winch issues have not yet been fixed, and they may not be fixed until late fall or winter. So we're not comfortable with that uncertainty, and we're intending to contract with an alternate vessel for dredge work beginning in 2024. There are benefits to having HabCam and dredge on the same vessel, because if you have issues with one sampling tool, you can switch to the other one and keep working. But given the vessel problems we've had, we're now thinking that it would be better to separate HabCam and dredge to ensure that we have more than one vessel under contract. And because a lot of people have asked, the Sharp did only charge us for the days we spent underway this year. The unused funds could be deobligated from the contract and presumably returned to the Science Center. It's not guaranteed we'd get them, but it's very likely that we'd get the funds back. Next slide, please. Just to clarify what we're considering, for dredge, we do plan to look for an alternate vessel. We're going to tour some vessels to get a feel for the platforms that are available, and we intend to work with staff from the New England Council to identify industry vessels that we should consider touring. We're hoping to get a contract out for bid later this fall. We also plan to explore options for conducting HabCam operations on an alternate vessel, but it's a little more complicated with HabCam because we'd either need to find a vessel with a suitable fiber optic winch or purchase a winch for the Science Center, which would of course require funds. If we can't find a suitable HabCam vessel, we do know that the Sharp schedule has availability for HabCam work next May or June, pending the winch repairs. And we have also scheduled 13 days aboard the Bigelow in June. The Bigelow A-frame repair should be completed by then, so we should have the ability to tow HabCam. If we do not need the Bigelow for towed HabCam work, we will plan to use those days for additional AUV testing and deployment. We'd like to make sure that we keep the communication lines open as these plans and changes develop. We'll be discussing our proposed plan with the New England Council staff this week, and we can plan to provide regular updates to both councils as part of the regular NEFSC report. And I'll make myself available to provide updates to the SCOLUP AP and committee as requested. Next slide, please. Finally, longer-term plans for wind mitigation are ongoing. We will clearly not be able to conduct randomly selected stations within wind energy areas once the turbines are up, and we aren't yet sure of the extent to which we'll be able to dredge or operate towed HabCam in those areas. We were able to get funds through an internal uncrewed systems grant to begin development of a HabCam payload for an AUV that we expect to be able to operate within wind energy areas. As I mentioned before, we were able to do some initial field testing aboard the Bigelow last July. We got some very promising results from that. We'll continue to develop and test the AUV over the winter, and we're hoping to bring it with us aboard our HabCam survey next summer. At a minimum, we'll be able to continue with field trials in 2024. The lead PI for the AUV project, Marina Martini, provided an update to the SCOLUP AP at their August meeting, and we'll be sure to keep you informed on progress with the AUV project. That is all I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Catherine. We have any questions? Adam Nowalski.
Thank you very much. So as I see the presentations, I see a lot of efforts underway to try to enhance redundancy to make sure the surveys get done, which I'm certainly glad to see. The HabCam AUV looks promising. Given the efforts that are underway to improve redundancy of surface vessels, if there's a move dependence on the AUV, what is the AUV redundancy backup plan?
Well, for the AUV, we're actually in the process of developing more than one unit. So right now we have access to 2 AUVs, but only one HabCam payload, a module that goes onto the nose of the AUV. We are planning to build a second payload this winter. And so then we will end up with two functional AUVs. So that's the main redundancy there. In terms of vessels, these AUVs are pretty small. I don't know the specs offhand, but I want to say they're about 8 feet long. They're pretty manageable, and in the end, you could be able to access these vehicles, launch and recover them from a number of different vessels. I don't think it's not gonna require a big vessel.
Tom Schlichter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious, in terms of the trawl surveys, when it becomes obvious that a days at sea will not be complete, do you prioritize some of the trawl areas over others, or does that stay at a random pattern?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do prioritize certain areas over others. This season was a good example. We were so severely cut, and we focused on Georges Bank because of its value to the Canadian and American assessment processes and the value of the stocks on Georges Bank. So those decisions do get made whenever we see sea days cut.
Follow up on that, please. Are areas sampled in the same order from year to year, or are they randomly selected?
They're sampled in the same order. The survey goes from the south to the north. There is a little bit of change within there based on weather and what stations might be able to be sampled in a given weather pattern, but it's basically south to north.
Peter Hughes.
Chair, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the presentation. I was fortunate enough to see it last week at the New England. So, utilizing the Pisces, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but it sounds a little bit like we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're taking a vessel out of the southern region, who is supposed to be doing work down there, survey work down there, and now we're utilizing it for survey work up here. And because of that, you are putting twice the effort of work and volume of work on that vessel, which just in turn may lead to faster breakdowns and going to require more shipyard work by sharing a vessel with another region, possibly degrading their surveys, and each region not getting the full surveys that they require to keep that 60-year timeline going, that survey timeline going. But I do have a question about the contract with alternative vessels. You'd mentioned it would be separate vessels for dredge and HabCam, and that you were going to try to put a comprehensive list of vessels together. Who do we speak to about that list? How do boats put their name in the hat for being on that list, so that you can come out and take a look at vessels?
John, did you want to address the first comment first, or should I go ahead and answer?
Peter, why don't you take the second one, and then I'll take this.
Okay, that's a great question, and I just want to be clear when I say we're going to tour vessels, it's not like if we didn't tour your vessel, you won't have an option to put a bid on the contract. We're touring vessels to just get a feel for the characteristics of the vessels and help us determine, what our base needs might be for conducting the survey in terms of, vessel size, endurance, berthing, deck space, things like that, data feeds, etc. But we are, as I mentioned, trying to identify some vessels that may be good represent, could represent well what is available in the fleet. So I would say if you know of a specific vessel that you think we should look at, feel free to email me directly or get in touch with Jonathan Peros, and we'll see what we can do to go take a look.
So thanks.
And Peter, just to sort of follow up on your sort of question comment about the Pisces, I don't see it as robbing Peter to pay Paul. I see it very much in this developing multiple options for us. We know the Pisces sister ship to Bigelow can use Bigelow gear. And so one option that we wanted to develop was the option to have Pisces come up and fill in for Bigelow if needed. When you look at, Northeast Fisheries Science Center bottom trawl survey is one of the highest priority surveys in NOAA fisheries. So that conversation, with the Southeast Center, with headquarters, was very straightforward. And so, we have it as an option. Hopefully we won't need to use it, and we will work to develop other options for ourselves. So we do have multiple options to get some resiliency in our fishery independent survey system.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Peter, a recommendation might be that you put a list of specifications that you're looking for on vessels so that people can work towards that build out of their vessels if they so choose to, so that they can put their vessel names in the list of vessels that might be under consideration for additional survey work. The only other thing I'll note is that when I have a broken winch on a vessel, that winch is fixed in 10, 14 days tops. And that might mean me bringing somebody over from Amsterdam, the Dutch individual that built that winch and engineered that winch. I have to bring them from overseas. Every day that boat during the season is tied to the dock is money lost. And I just think that as a commercial fisherman with a commercial fishing background, our mentality is a little bit different. We need to get out on the water and get the work done. It just doesn't sound like there's that whole drive in these UNOLS vessels and the white boats. So just an observation there. Thank you.
Skip Beller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentations. I guess this question is for Catherine. I know VIMS in the past has always done a very extensive shark survey. Is that part of y'all's survey, or do y'all use their survey?
I would have to get back to you on that. The Northeast Fisheries Science Center oversees the whole coastband network that's done by multiple institutions, but I don't have the details in front of me on that. I don't know if there's somebody else on the call that would be able to answer that. Please feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah, I mean, Catherine, I think you're right. It's all part of that coastband survey structure. VIMS, has their part, and Northeast Fisheries Science Center has our part, and it contributes to the shark assessments that are, led either by ASNFC or through the CDAR process in the Southeast.
Thanks, John.
Any more questions, comments around the table? Peter?
Thanks, Wes. I do have a motion to put forward once the questions, comments are.
Okay, give it just a couple more minutes. Any more questions or comments around the table? Questions from the audience? Comments from the audience? Go online. Julia Evans.
Yes, sir. Thank you for letting me speak. My name is Captain Julie Evans. I, excuse me, fishermen, commercial, recreational. We are the #1 historic for wind farm energy. When you're in the discussion, I noticed that, obviously, science is very important. It's very important to us. It's very important to me as I've worked in this area with trolls, et cetera, in the past. And I'm wondering why the wind farms are not contributing to this. And it seems like we're doing it a little bit backwards. Why wasn't this sort of done before BOEM laid out the wind energy farms and let them make bids, all over the world? I don't know if you have that information, but I'd certainly like to know why haven't they been contacted to supply some funds for our very special trawls, which I totally support. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that. It's a good point. The planning for wind has been ongoing for more than a decade at this point. And the question has been raised and efforts have been put in place, including with BOEM funding, to address some of these concerns. So some of those projects that I mentioned in my presentation, we're starting to see some of the fruits of that labor. It's hard work to figure out exactly what the impacts are going to be. And we have a person focused on looking at how we can adapt and utilize the fisheries surveys that offshore wind farms are conducting. They conduct those surveys for the purpose of impact assessment. So they're not designed to fill in for our stock assessment work, for example. But there may be ways that we can optimize that work, maximize its value. And we do have efforts that are focused on that right now, and specific people that are really paying attention to that topic and working with organizations like ROSA, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, to really make sure that we're taking advantage of those science activities as well.
Thank you, Catherine. James Fletcher.
I sent you a request that you consider an aluminum crew boat or an aluminum oil supply boat, which are equipment that is standardized and have very little maintenance problems. The reason for this is to see if it is possible to do electronic pulse surveys. And the first response is electricity and salt water don't mix. But I point out to you in the Netherlands and the UK, they are using trawls with electric pulses on it. So we're getting newer knowledge. But a lot of these surveys, if they were done using electric fishing, it would be better. So I would ask that you consider any new or replacement vessel have an aluminum hull. And on the other side of the coin, we need to come up with some way to verify the surveys that are being done, because something the fishermen are seeing way more than what the surveys are saying. So I thank you for your time, but I'd appreciate it if you look at you get an aluminum hull for whatever replacement vessel you can use. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Fletcher, thank you very much for the idea. And, we're certainly looking into it with you and the group that you put us in touch with. So we'll continue to sort of explore the idea as we get more information about some more details about the electric sampling that you have envisioned. And I think the group that you're working with, is it Smith Root? Is that right? Yeah, so anyway, I think it's Smith Root, so we'll continue to sort of put some details around the idea. Thank you.
If I may tell you, I've contacted Smith Root and they are not interested in going down this road. route. They say that the generators that they use are pulse generators and they can no longer acquire them. So we're going to have to look for someone else. But where my thought is, supposedly Bowman and the wind farms are the experts on electricity and salt water. So we go to Bowman and the wind farms and let their experts tell us how to do it. Don't say what we want to do.
Good morning, Jack.
Tell me how to do it. Thank you.
Oh, I'm on a wind farm Zoom call with the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Council, and because
Your mic's still on.
it's all right. It's very upsetting what they're doing to the fishermen here in East Hampton. We need to have a fundraiser to start a legal fund.
You got her muted, Stephen? Okay, thank you. Scott Lennox?
Yeah, I just thought of a quick question. I'd be interested to know how much of the current survey grid will be lost once all of the wind energy areas are unavailable for the surveys.
The back of the envelope calculation right now is about 10%, but we don't know the actual answer to that question because the wind areas haven't all been established at this point in time, and they do change year to year. So the other consideration to keep in mind is that some strata are actually much more impacted than other strata. So we do have some strata that there is no wind energy development in, and then others where it's close to, I think we do have one stratum where 100% of the stratum is covered by wind. So it's not just the whole area, it's also these more localized effects as well that we're trying to determine those impacts.
Peter Hughes?
So with the build out of the wind farms, I think you're going to have to increase your fuel budget because you're going to have to go around these farms just like the commercial fisheries are. We're not going to be able to navigate them. It's highly unlikely the Bigelow is going to be able to navigate them. That line item, but in your budget, added fuel costs. But I do have a motion that was made up at the New England last week, and Mr. Chairman, if you're ready to put that, happy to do so, or if you want.
I don't see any more hands, so bring on the motion.
Okay, so thanks. So I was privileged enough last week to attend the New England Fisheries Management Council. We had this same, relatively same presentation, and there was a motion made to develop a white paper. The Science Center develop a white paper. I'm going to read the motion record. This is the motion that was made from the Fishery Management Council, and in response to the motion, that was a letter has already been developed, shared with this council. Chris emailed it, supplemental documents that. And the motion reads: the council requests that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, NEFSC, to develop a white paper to be submitted to the council by January 12th, 2024, outlining an industry-based survey as complementary to spring and autumn bottom trawls.
Do we have a second on the motion? Dan Farnham? Any discussions, questions on the motion? Adam Nowalski?
What is the Science Center's response to this, particularly with a date provided to them? Is this something they're already working on? Is this something the center is willing to do? Is this time frame reasonable? I'd love to hear a response on at least those three. Again, I'm completely in favor of complementary industry work. I think it's a way forward, but I'm also not interested in just sending a letter that's not going to get a positive response.
Dr. Hare?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Adam. As Catherine laid out, the Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel has already been sort of, talking about developing, multiple options. How do we create either supplemental surveys or complementary surveys? How do we build resiliency in our fishery independent survey system? And so, this is something that we would be interested to take a look at. That January 12th date is reasonable, assuming that we sort of continue operating. So if we shut down in November, then that January 12th date becomes unreasonable. But assuming that our funding situation is dealt with, I think January 12th is doable. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, John. Any more questions? Comments? Is there any objection to the motion? Any abstentions to the motion? One abstention. National Marine Fisheries Service. Motion passes by consent. Catherine, Pete, do you have anything else to bring forward to us today?
Nope, that's it. Thank you, everybody. It was great to be here.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. Let's take a 10-minute break. Let's be back promptly at 10:17. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. 3 minutes past my 10:17 deadline. Let's go to our next agenda item. Policy process for reviewing exempted fishing permit applications for unmanaged forage amendment ecosystem component species. Of all the things, we need an acronym for that one. Whenever you're ready, Julia, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm ready while the presentation's coming up. Here we go. So the objective of this part of this agenda item is to review a draft policy and process document that's related to the council's review of exempted fishing permit applications for species that are listed as ecosystem components under the unmanaged forage omnibus amendment. So there is a draft document in the briefing materials, and I'm going to summarize it in this PowerPoint. And I'm focusing on the document that was the first one behind the tab, which is the staff recommendation for the document, which incorporates recommendations from the EOP, AP, and committee. Both groups met in the spring of this year to start discussions on what should be in this document. And then they reviewed a draft document in September last month. They recommended some revisions. So all of those revisions are incorporated into the staff recommendation. And then there's additional revision that was discussed by the AP and the committee, but it wasn't agreed to unanimously by both groups. But staff had some further discussions after the meeting with GARFO, and we think it makes sense to kind of take it one step further than what the AP and committee agreed to, and change how the role of the council and GARFO is described in the document. And I'll describe that in more detail because I'm going to walk through all the sections of the document in the next few slides. So after I cover all of that, then the objective would be for the council to consider if additional revisions are needed, and then consider approval of the policy and process document. So some of the background on this information is kind of incorporated into the draft document itself. So I'm just going to jump right into walking through the different sections of the draft document. And the first section describes the goal of the document. So the goal is to establish a standard process for council review of exempted fishing permit applications for the forage amendment ecosystem component species, and also to communicate the council's priorities for those ecosystem component species to prospective applicants. And this part of the document also states that exempted fishing permits are for short-term exemptions to certain specified fishing regulations. And if there's a desire to pursue longer-term fishing effort that might require the council to pursue a separate management action, that use of an EFP does not guarantee that the council will take those next steps. This was something that was discussed by the AP and the committee, that this, this document is focused just on EFPs. EFPs can be a first step towards additional changes, but the council's not committing itself to considering any future management changes, because those that would need to be based on reviewing the results of the EFP and other considerations. So this is just focused on that first step of using an EFP. So the next part of the draft document defines what an EFP is. An EFP is a permit that exempts a vessel from certain specified federal fishing regulations. And EFPs may be used for a number of reasons, including data collection, exploratory fishing, market research, product development, and other reasons. Exempted fishing permits for the forage amendment ecosystem component species are issued by GARFO. They're typically, EFPs in general are typically issued for 1 year, but they can be renewed. And the AP and committee thought it was important to work into our document that even though EFPs are typically just issued for 1 year at a time, multiple years of data collection is generally preferable from a scientific perspective. The next section of the document summarizes the requirements of the forage amendment, and it includes the goal statement from the forage amendment, which was to prohibit the development of new and expansion of existing directed commercial fisheries for unmanaged forage species until the council has had an adequate opportunity to assess the scientific information related to any new or expanded directed fisheries and consider potential impacts to existing fisheries, fishing communities, and the marine ecosystem. And EFPs must be consistent with this goal. So the way the forage amendment went about attempting to achieve that goal was that it implemented a 1,700-pound commercial possession limit in mid-Atlantic federal waters for the combined weight of all the species that were listed as ecosystem components. And it also stated that EFPs should be used as a first step towards considering allowing landings beyond that 1,700-pound possession limit. Because remember on the previous slide, it said the goal is to prohibit these activities until the council can consider a number of things. So the goal is not to prohibit these sorts of activities indefinitely. And then there's an additional statement in the background section referencing part of the regulations that an advisory panel member thought was really important to include, and the APN committee agreed to include it. And it's just a part of the regulations that states that exemptions from these forage amendment requirements can be granted for the purposes of experimental fishing and contributing to the development of new or expansion of existing fisheries for mid-Atlantic forage species. So the intent behind kind of quoting these regulations in the draft policy and process document was to help illustrate that there is certain allowances for taking steps towards considering new or expansion of existing fisheries for these species. And then there's another part of document in terms of how it relates to the forage amendment is that there is one change that this is part of the staff recommendation compared to what the council agreed to through the forage amendment. So through the forage amendment, the council stated that you wanted to review EFP applications for these forage amendment species before GARFA would review them. And that was based on the process that the Pacific Council uses for their EFPs for all of their species, not just their forage species. But after further discussion of this, and we did have some lessons learned from an ongoing thread herring EFP application and some further discussions with the AP and the committee and talking to GARFO staff. Staff recommendation is to modify this part of the process to say that instead of the council completing their review first, that the council and GARFO will work together to review the applications concurrently. And you'll see on a later slide, there's a recommendation that a certain part of the GARFO process not occur until certain steps of the council review have taken place, but that up until that point, the council and GARFO would be working together. And part of the rationale for this change is that you'll see there's like a number of questions that we're recommending that the council consider for reviewing each EFP. And some of those questions you can't really answer without input from GARFO. Part of the process is recommending that the EOP committee play a role in the review. GARFO is part of the committee. And there were concerns raised about timelines and inefficiencies if GARFO couldn't start their review until the council finished their review. Also, it was noted that based on the way the regulations are phrased, they're national level regulations for all EFPs. The council can't require that applications be sent to the council prior to GARFO. So with all that considered, staff recommend that this just be phrased a little differently than it was phrased in the forage amendment, just to say that the council and GARFO will work together to review applications. And just a certain part of the GARFO review process, the council would recommend waiting until certain council review steps take place. The next section of the document describes the required contents of EFP applications for these forage amendment species. And this is pretty long, and it's modeled off of what's already required in the federal regulations for all EFPs. And there's some additions for the forage amendment species to kind of clarify some things that are important to the council for those species. So anything with an asterisk next to it means that it's either something that's in addition to what's in the federal regulations, or it's kind of expanding what's already in the federal regulations. And if it doesn't have an asterisk, then it's the same as what's already required. The APN committee thought it would be important to kind of incorporate the council's forage amendment specific requirements with the existing federal requirements. So this could be a one-stop shop for people who want to apply for EFPs, so they don't have to look at one document for the council requirements and a different document for all the federal requirements. So it's all together in one place. And I will try to walk through this as quickly as I can, but there is a lot here. There's some kind of generic stuff like contact information, date of the application, Number 3 is statement of the purposes and goals of the exempted fishery for which an EFP is needed, including justification for issuance of the EFP. And then the committee and AP agreed to add on this 3.1 here, which says that the applicant should also describe their ultimate fishery management goals. So for example, if the EFP is a first step towards considering if a larger, longer term directed fishery could be viable, and if that would require council management or action to allow that longer term activity to occur, that the applicants should state that in their application so the council has an idea of the ultimate goals of the applicant. The applications must also describe the time and location of the fishing activity and the type, size, and amount of gear to be used. Some additional information about the specific vessels that will use the EFP. That language is already required under the federal regulations. Number 6 is the species expected to be caught under the EFP, including the amount of expected to be landed and discarded, including targeted and incidental and managed and unmanaged species. The application should also describe the expected impacts of all landings and discards on fisheries, fishing communities, EFH, marine mammals, threatened and endangered species, and the marine ecosystem. So a lot of the things there are already required under the federal regulations, and this is just expanding it a little bit to add in some of that forage amendment language to think about both landings and discards, both managed and unmanaged, and some of these ecosystem and community considerations, but things like impacts on EFH, marine mammals, threatened and endangered species, that's already required under the federal regulations. The application should also justify the specific catch levels requested. And given limited available data and lack of stock assessments for the ecosystem component species, the applicants should consider incremental increases above recent landings to mitigate concerns about potential impacts of larger increases in landings. And the document has a link to the annual updates that we get on landings of these species to help applicants know what recent trends in landings are. The application should also describe procedures for monitoring all catch, including incidental catch and discards, and applicants may wish to consider mechanisms for observer coverage. Applicants are also encouraged to collect information that can assist with future management and stock assessments of the ecosystem component species, such as length, weight, age, sex, and maturity information, and they should provide details for any planned biological sampling programs. Applicants are encouraged to consider gear modifications and fishing strategies to reduce bycatch. The application should include a brief description of the qualifications of the applicant and project partners, the signature of the applicant, other information as necessary to ensure compliance with all applicable laws, regulations, and executive orders, and other information if requested by the council or GARFO. And then the next section elaborates a little bit more on the applicable laws, regulations, and executive orders side of things. EFPs must comply with all of that. That includes the Magnuson Act, NEPA, Endangered Species Act, and Marine Mammal Protection Act, and others. And this may require additional analysis. So on the kind of more extensive side of things, it could require an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement for NEPA, an EFH consultation, and or a new ESA consultation. An important consideration is how similar or different are the proposed fishing activities to existing managed federal waters fisheries in terms of things like the gear types, the seasons, and the locations of fishing effort. So if the exemption proposes to operate in a way that the existing federal waters managed fisheries are already operating, then limited additional analysis might be needed. But if the proposed fishing activities are notably different, if they use different gear types or fishing in different areas, then quite extensive additional analysis might be needed. And applicants should consult with the council and GARFO to determine what additional analyses might be required. I think this is an important step where it's important to have GARFO involved as part of the council review process, because council staff on our own can't really say what sort of documentation is required to ensure compliance with the Endangered Species Act, for example, but GARFO would play a key role in helping us figure out some of these questions. This document also in the section notes that these additional analyses can be time consuming, and GARFO and council staff can provide only limited support giving existing workload constraints. So kind of trying to warn the applicants that, they might need to put in a substantial amount of effort to figure out what additional analyses are needed and potentially contribute towards those analyses themselves. So next, the document describes the steps in the process for obtaining an EFP for these species. So step 1 is to submit the application to the council and GARFO. This part of the document says that the application can be submitted to the council and GARFO at the same time or the council first. And the documents should be submitted 1 year prior to the desired start of exempted fishing activities. The federal regulations for all EFPs request 60 days in advance, but given the additional levels of review required for these species, this document would say a 1 year timeframe. So staff would first work with GARFO to determine if the application is complete. And if it is complete, then it will proceed to the next steps in the review. So that's step 2 is the actual review by the council and GARFO. This has a bunch of levels within step 2. The EOP, AP, and committee thought it would be helpful if SSC review was one of the first steps in this process. Of course, it's always up to the council if they want to task the SSC with anything specific. So the council, after determining that an application is complete, would consider if they want to task the SSC with reviewing that specific application. The AP and committee thought it would be important to note in the document that it would be expected that most applications would be reviewed by the SSC because they thought that could be very valuable and very important. And then each time the council leadership would approve terms of reference for the SSC to address, which would be tailored to each application, but would generally be expected to focus on the adequacy of the proposed sampling methodology to allow for determination of if the stated purposes and goals of the EFP have been met, to accurately estimate landings and discards of all caught species, and to provide information that may be useful to future stock assessments and management. And the SSC could also comment on the EFP's consistency with the goals of the forage amendment. So the next step would generally be review by the committee and AP, and then there's a list of questions to guide their review. Of course, staff would assist with answering some of these questions. So they would think about, is the application complete? Are the proposed catch levels sufficiently justified? Is the proposed data collection methodology sufficient to accurately estimate landings and discards of all target and incidentally caught species? Will the information collected allow for a determination of if the stated purposes and goals of the EFP have been met? Will the information collected support an assessment of the impacts of all catch on all these things that the council is concerned about? I won't read that long list again. Can the information collected assist with future management and stock assessments of these or other species? And have the applicants determined if any additional analysis is needed to comply with applicable laws? And then if the application requests renewal of a previously issued EFP, has the extension for an additional year been justified? Is the proposal consistent with the goals of the forage amendment and the council's other FMPs? Do the applicants and associated project partners have a history of relevant work to suggest they can successfully complete the proposed project? So after all that review takes place, the council would then consider all of the feedback from the SSC, the committee, and AP, and then consider the application and determine if they want to provide additional feedback to the applicants and or provide comments during the Federal Register comment period, which I will describe on a later slide. And the document notes that unless requested by council leadership, applications that are revised after any of these steps of review do not require additional review to confirm the adequacy of the revisions. If the council still has major concerns with the application, they could express that to GARFO through the Federal Register comment period, because again, ultimately it's GARFO who's approving or not approving the EFP applications. So the next step is that GARFO would consider the application for approval and publish a Federal Register notice. So this is something that's required for all EFPs. Once GARFO determines the application is complete and warrants further consideration, they they would publish a Federal Register notice, which would briefly describe the proposal and announce a 15 to 45-day public comment period. For all the other EFPs right now, for their not forage amendment species, this is typically the timeframe when the council gets involved. GARFO notifies the council, and the council may or may not write a comment letter. But for these species specifically, the draft document right now says that the council requests that GARFO wait until after the SSC, EOP committee, and EOP AP reviews are complete before taking this specific step. So the intent behind that is to kind of not slow things down once this step happens, that if the comment period is only 15 to 45 days, that this certain level of review has already taken place, so the council could feel like they could have not enough time to write informed comments, considering all the review that has taken place up to that step. So this was trying to strike the balance between the intent of the forage amendment to have the council review the applications first, but provide some efficiencies in the process by having just this step. The council would request that this would wait until after these certain steps of the review. Again, this would just be a request because the way the federal regulations are written, they're for all EFPs nationwide, and the council cannot require that that GARFO hold off on this part of it until these review steps have taken place, but the council could request that. And then the next few sections are just pulling from the federal regulations for all EFPs in terms of the GARFO process. So there's a description of terms and conditions that could be applied, things like total harvest limits, trip limits, year restrictions, observers, VMS, or other electronic monitoring, data reporting requirements, and provisions for public release of data. There's also examples of reasons why an EFP might be denied. So it could be concerns about detrimental impacts, inconsistency with the FMPs and applicable laws, enforcement concerns, and other reasons. The next section is if the applicant has successfully obtained the EFP, then they can use their EFP. And this is just reiterating what's already in the federal regulations in terms of things about abiding by all terms and conditions. In the EFP must be presented for inspection whenever appropriate. It must be retained with any of the fish that are caught as part of that EFP. Again, this is all just pulling from the federal regulations. The next, I think this is the last step in the process, is that after the EFP is complete, within 6 months, the applicants should submit a report to the council and GARFO summarizing the EFP activities, including total landings and discards by species, conclusions relative to the stated goals of the EFP, and any conclusions regarding impacts on all these things that the council is concerned about. And the council and GARFO may determine that additional requirements are needed for these reports. They may also require interim progress reports, and any publications resulting from the EFP activity should also be shared with the council and GARFO. So that is the gist of what's in the draft document that's recommended by staff. Again, it's based on the EOP, AP, and committee discussion. There was one more topic that the EOP, AP, and committee discussed that it's not something for inclusion in this document, but for future discussion and next steps. This was brought up briefly yesterday during the implementation plan discussion. But the idea is that this document right now focuses on using an EFP. And an EFP might be first step towards considering a longer term change or longer term fishing activity. So the committee and the AP talked about the next steps after the EFP in terms of what the council would do. It might be helpful to kind of clarify that. That could help the council. It could also help prospective EFP applicants. They didn't think this was something that needed to be spelled out right now, but it could be useful for the council to think about this in the future as, you know, maybe there's more new and emerging fisheries that are under consideration, just to kind of have those steps spelled out. And the specific steps might kind of depend on the type of management action that's under consideration. But again, just something that the AP and committee wanted to flag for future consideration. That's all I had. And again, the objective of the discussion today is to approve a policy and process document for EFP applications for these forage species.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for the presentation. Any questions, comments, concerns?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank Julia for all of the work and effort that she put into the development of this draft policy, as well as the committee and advisors for all of the hard work that they did. I think, you know, we had a really good meeting in Baltimore last month to discuss all of the feedback that had been provided. It was a very robust discussion. Definitely appreciated Garfo staff being there to help out with that. And, you know, I think that the staff recommendation for current review by the council and Garfo is, you know, strikes the right balance of what we were looking for, of having a policy that provides clarity to prospective applicants, but also doesn't unnecessarily bog down the process. So, you know, I'll leave it at that. Other folks who participated in the discussion can chime in, but I would certainly be ready to make a motion when we get to that point, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Michelle. Adam Nowalski.
I support the document as written. I do have a question, and I think this is Garfo, since they are ultimately responsible for approving these. Part of this process includes I think, that favorable review from the council, SSC, EOP, committee, advisors, ultimately the full council, is a carrot that would encourage approval by the service for an EFP application. But given that the service is ultimately responsible, is there any stick that would be associated with this, that if the council did not look as favorably on an application, what position is the service in then to defer to and use that as criteria for complete disapproval, if any? I think I'd be interested in hearing that. You know, one thing that caught my attention, for example, in the presentation, the slide said must provide completed reports afterwards. You know, I think we've heard the word should. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I think it raises that concern. Is we have no guarantee after an applicant submits something, we have no way of going back and forcing them to actually provide those reports. Ultimately, again, I think the carrot would be that if they wanted to submit an EFP in the future, if they didn't submit completed reports for past projects, I don't think the service and or the council would look as kindly upon them. But is there any stick associated with any of this that the service intends to have, such as promulgating something that says we will in fact defer to this policy, or where do we stand moving forward with our advice? How binding would that ultimately be to this policy?
Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. There's a lot to unpack there. And you touch on a number of the points that I was gonna raise in a comment. So let me touch on your first kind of most direct question, which I'm going to restate as, if the council raised a number of concerns or issues with an EFP application, would that the agency use that to decline to deny an application? I think the answer to that is most probably. And it gets back to some of the points that Julia raised in her presentation around what are the objectives of the, is it ultimately to develop a new or expanded fishery for a stock that's not currently subject to a fishery, or is currently subject to the very low forage amendment possession limits, and somebody wants to expand that into a larger fishery? And if that's the objective, and the council raises a number of concerns related to the information that would be provided as a result of the EFP that the council feels would be needed in order to evaluate and take action to produce that expanded fishery through a fishery management plan amendment or something like that. And we would certainly use that and work with the applicant to try to ensure that their application is going to gather the information the council feels it needs. And so I think the council review is very important. If the council's review, concludes, yes, this EFP application would provide us all the information we would need to make a future decision about a new fishery, then that's going to help us evaluate that EFP. I think that the opposite is true, that if there's information lacking that the council felt was necessary, that would also form our decision. Like, while I have the floor, well, first let me pause and see if that answers your question, Adam. I have some other comments, kind of touch on some of the other.
I think it offers insight. I think what was left unsaid, and I don't want to put words in the service's mouth, but what was left unsaid was if the council does not look favorably on an application, that does not preclude the service from approving it anyway.
That's true. It's not, we can't reject an EFP application simply because the council like it or didn't approve some aspect of it. But that would get into sort of the details and the nuances. What is the EFP application trying to achieve? What is the information provided? And we all the information available to us, including the council's review. But it can't limit our discretion. We would have discretion to both disapprove an EFP that council wanted to see approved, but also to approve an EFP that council did not want to see approved. But I think those instances are pretty rare because we want to work collaboratively with the council. And if ultimately, again, if the objective of the EFP is to collect information, demonstrate that the council should consider a new or changed fishery management plans to enable a new fishery to be developed, and the council's input would be critical to that. But sort of the larger issue, we support, I think, the concept of this paper and the policy in principle, but there are a number of aspects that are a little bit challenging for us from a process and a regulatory perspective. One thing, the 1 year time frame. Our experience with the thread herring EFP is 1 year is actually pretty optimistic to go from 0 to 100 in terms of a brand new EFP for a new developing fishery. We've been working, as I think everybody knows, with Lunds on the thread herring EFP for a couple of years now. We're still not at the point where we would say we have a complete EFP application. So, hopefully we're going to make progress. I know Lunds is committed to working on this. They've put a lot of resources into this, and we're working with them as well. But it's quite an extended time frame and extended process. The concept of a complete EFP application is a little tricky. As Julia notes in her presentation, a number of the things that would be in the council's process document are not required under the regulation. So technically, a complete EFP application from our perspective would not need to include those additional items. And it would be difficult for us if we were working directly with an applicant. The applicant says, look, we've provided everything that's required in your regulation. How can you say our application isn't? Have a hard time responding. Once we determine an application is complete, the regulations provide a 60-day time frame for us, not a year. So we have some challenges there. So while the concurrent review as a collaborative exchange of information and process is, again, I support that in principle, but I think we need to be a little bit flexible in terms of what is complete, in terms of what would start the council's process. For example, I think, Julia, you had in your presentation somewhere during that 1 year, there would be a determination if additional analysis is necessary to comply with other applicable laws, such as NEPA or ESA. Well, then, according to our regs, if additional analysis is necessary, the application wasn't complete. So that that sort of terminology about what's complete and what starts what clock, I think, is a little bit tricky. But again, in principle, we support this, and I think we want to work with the council to make sure that these any applications that are related to the Forage Amendment, particularly those for new developing or expanded fisheries, we want to work with you to make this process as effective and as efficient as possible for you and the applicants. But just, I want everybody to recognize we can't be held, the agency can't be held to some of the strictures that are in this process document, although we do support it in principle.
Maureen?
Thank you, Wes. Related to what Mike was saying, the application is described by the council as very detailed, and they would like to be able to use the information to see whether or not the EFP request in the project is introducing a new or expanding fishery. Also in our policy that we were discussing, there's going to be a report to the council 6 months after the termination of the EFP. My first question is kind of procedural. If they're going to renew their EFP, where does that, what happens to their report at that time? But I think that the results that will be demonstrated in that report should probably have more bearing on to whether or not this is a new or expanding fishery than the application itself, because that's where we will see what fish they collected, how much they fished, what was their bycatch, how did that affect? And so I would like to see a little bit more emphasis placed on the report that they're going to submit at the end of their EFP than maybe the stuff that's collected in their application. Their report's going to be written by consultants or biologists, and it's going to have information in there that will give us a much better idea of what's going on than their application ever could. So I would think that we need to perhaps be a little bit more specific in terms of what we expect from their report and what bearing the report would have on them getting an EFP in the future or related to their current project. I hope that there isn't any specific GARFO procedures for the report, but I think we need to focus on that so that we have something to work with to see what they're going to do in the future. Thank you.
Maureen? Any more questions, comments from the table? Adam?
So we're calling this policy and process for council review of exempted fishing permit applications. We know that the council is not the body that approves or disapproves. We heard comments that we cannot control, and in fact, the service has some reservation about some of the stipulations we've made here. I'm wondering if we change the titling of this to, instead of it being the policy and process for the application itself, maybe focusing more on this as a guide to applicants for information that the council needs to review the applications, as opposed to a policy and process. I view this more as a guide, I think, at this point, as opposed to a policy and process that an applicant must adhere to. I don't know if that would help address some of the concerns we've heard from the service directly. But I think that would be, I want to put something out there that sets very clear expectations to applicants. I think that's my #1 goal here. And I have concerns about this as we're labeling it, that an applicant's going to think, if we make the council happy, boom, Garfo is good to go. Or if the council's not happy, then I think there's an expectation here that a applicant could just say, well, we don't really care what the council thinks. They're just an advisory body on this. We're going to work directly with Garfo. And I don't think we want to encourage that at all. So that's my thinking here. Maybe everybody's happy with that. We're calling it as a policy and a process, that it's just a guide to applicants anyway. But I think we could provide some more clarity by including that either as a title for this or some more introductory information, because that's what I see this as. This isn't our policy for submitting an application as much as it is a guide for what we want to see in order for the council to appropriately provide feedback that the service will use in ultimately approving. Put that out there and see if there's any appetite for it from anybody else around it.
All right, thank you, Adam. Julia, can I get some clarification? Why is it called policy and process? Just you have an answer?
That's how the council phrased it in the implementation plan. So I think the goal was to lay out the steps like a process and communicate what the council thinks is important regarding the forage species. So more on the policy side of things. So I think if I'm understanding what Adam's suggesting, it would be like the content of it stays very similar. It's just kind of called something different to make it more clear. And maybe that would ultimately have the same impact. But that, again, the policy and process was just language that the council used on the implementation planning discussion. And I'm not sure if I recall a lot of discussion about why it needs to be called that specifically, but I think the change that Adam suggested could potentially have the same impact.
Kel, do you have how's your thoughts on this as committee chair?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I think if the change to a guide rather than a policy and process provides clarity to future applicants, and I agree with that, and that's what we're trying to do here is, provide guidance for applicants so they have a clear expectation of the type of information and analyses that would inform future decisions that a future council might make with respect to new and or expanded forage fisheries. Then, I certainly support that. If the rest of the council supports that as well. I mean, I agree that anything we can do to provide that guidance and to make it clear that, we are encouraging applicants to adhere to this guidance because it is going to assist future decision making, but I think also, assist Garfo as well in the decisions that they have to make.
Any comments around the table? Mike Penny.
Yeah, I mean, again, I said something along these lines when the issue first came up in terms of a policy or process document. I think there's a lot of value in this sense of if let's sort of clear the decks and somebody comes to us, the agency, the council, and says, we have an idea for a new fishery for a forage species. We think that there's a species that's moving into mid-Atlantic waters that we could make a go of developing a fishery. What do we do? How do we get an EFP to show you that we can have a fishery? And having a document like this that explains sort of step by step the information that the council feels necessary forward, I think would be very useful. It's also useful in the sense of if somebody comes to us, the agency, and says, we want an EFP to do X, Y, or Z, focused on a forage amendment species or forage species, just like we did with thread herring, we're going to want the council's input in that before we make a decision. And so if we just say, well, we need to work with the council, and we come to the council and there's no established process for how and when the EOP committee gets involved, or what the staff does, or what information the council wants, or what the SSC would do, then it's just probably one reason why we're in year 3 of working on the thread herring EFP ones. So having that formalized so that there's a stepwise process and a clear identification of the information the council feels necessary to have, again, I think that's very helpful. Where my concerns lie is not in the council having this document, because I think there's a lot of value to that. It's the implication that, you know, a complete application is going to take a year, that the agency's timeframes are sort of intertwined in this. And so I think as long as there's a recognition that this process is to get the council's review as input to the agency's ultimate decision, then I think it's very helpful. And as long as it can be structured that way, without introducing confusion to applicants about how the council's process is either replacing or the agency's process and regulatory regulations, then I think there's a lot of value in it.
Or comments around the table? Bobby Rule?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, sound fine.
First off, I apologize if I'm a few chapters behind, and I apologize for that sound. But I completely understand the need and the utility of having the council be involved in the guidance of creating an EFP. But it seems to me that the council would be better served to not so much in the process of granting an EFP, but to review the information generated by 1 year of prosecution of that EFP. It just seems that you'd be able to base a lot more information and a lot more decision making off tangible, data than speculation at the beginning of the EFP process. And if that was discussed earlier, if that's within the document, I just haven't got there yet. I apologize, but it just seems that it's more the council. To me, the council would be better served to have more utility in being able to review after a 1 year issuing of the permit or prosecution of that particular permit, as opposed to trying to do it all before the permit is actually issued, before trying to speculate on what the possibilities are, as opposed to actually looking at data that could be generated, data generated from the prosecution of it. Thank you.
Bobby? More comments around the table? Caldeval?
So I guess maybe a question for Mike. Mike, is there like another, I'm just looking at, the document that's in the briefing materials and under the end of the second paragraph, your policy goal, where it notes that utility doesn't guarantee that the council will develop a management action to allow longer term harvest. Is there another sentence that could be added there that would get to, what you were just saying about the agency's role, and that this guidance document does not supplant the agency's authority with respect to approval of an EFP? I mean, I know we have that language further down in the document. Would it be more helpful, and from your perspective, to have an additional sentence that clarifies that right up front?
Good, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think something along the lines that's more upfront that, this kind of gets at maybe what Adam was getting at, that the following provides, guidance to applicants to inform them of the information that the council believes necessary, not replace the regulatory requirements or process that the agency must follow to make decisions on EFP. I don't have the specific language in my head, but something along those lines I think would be helpful.
Michelle?
So then, just procedurally, I think we've asked staff to develop a sentence to capture that. I think we could also ask for consideration of a retitling, as Adam has suggested, to guidance for exempted fishing permit applications. I haven't heard. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more feedback from other council members around the table with respect to the title of this document. Policy or process is fine. If they would prefer guidance document instead, does it make a difference?
Mike
And then
Penning?
I guess maybe if there are those couple of changes, would we still move forward with, and everybody's on board with that, would we still move forward with approval of this document today, as modified, noting that there are a couple of changes that we're not necessarily going to.
Yes, if we make changes, we can still get things finalized today. Mike?
Yeah, thanks. And I think maybe, what also might help clarify the intent of this is sort of related to to Bobby Rule's comment about, the focus of the council should be on evaluating the information that comes out of the EFP, make a decision about the next steps. And I think that should really be the focus. In other words, the agency has a process to determine whether an EFP application should be approved. But those are pretty narrow in scope and intent of, what's the 1 year, the impact of 1 year of this activity. It's generally the scope is, much, much smaller than the scope of what would be a fishery that the council would contemplate. And so I think the focus and use of this document is to inform applicants on the information the council would want at the end of the process, at the end of the EF, make an informed decision about future fishery management action, and less focus on what information the council feels is necessary to approve an EFP. Hopefully, I'm being clear in that in how I'm distinguishing that, because I think then that helps the applicant understand why they're going through the council, not just to get their EFP approved, to get an EFP approved that then can be used to promote a fishery or develop a fishery at the end of the day. So hopefully that clarification, maybe or response, can be reflected somewhere.
Julia?
Thanks. To that point, during the AP and committee meetings, there was some discussion of the thread herring EFP as an example of, it's been going on for like 2+ years now. The applicants are contributing a significant amount of money to fund some analysis to address concerns that Garfo raised about impacts to protected species, to get it to the place where the application could be considered complete. The application suggests that they would purchase new nets specifically for the purpose of this exempted fishing activity. And maybe this is a unique example, but there was some discussion of the amount of kind of resources that the applicant is dedicating to this EFP, and that if there's some sort of council process for reviewing the applications, like on the front end, if the council has major concerns, then that could help prevent a situation where an applicant invests significant amounts of resources into something that the council might not look favorably on. So it could help in that sense. So that was just one example of some of the discussions of why the review first, as well as the review afterwards, could be beneficial.
Joe Semino?
Yeah, thanks. And I didn't want to keep this discussion going, but this gets back to what Maureen said about the importance of the report. And so I guess my question is, this is guidance, and this is what at the end result, what the council's most interested in. Where does it fall as far as a requirement? Required to do that level of report, collect that amount of information. That's just an ask.
Julia?
So there is language in the federal regulations right now that says that it does use the word must submit an application or a report to GARFO within 6 months, and it does have some language about what should be in the report to some extent. So they are already required to submit a report to GARFO no later than 6 months after concluding the exempted fishing activity. So the council would just be requesting that they also submit that report to the council, and it provides a little bit more detail on what should be in the report, but they still would have to provide a report to GARFO regardless. So hopefully it wouldn't be too much of a concern that they wouldn't generate a report at all. And hopefully GARFO would, if they just sent it to GARFO, hopefully GARFO would share it with the council anyway.
Yeah, and thanks. I mean, but just to clarify, that's the standard report requirement for every EFP we issue, no matter what. And so what the council may want to see in terms of a report for a forage EFP focused on developing a new fishery might be different than what we would require sort of for every other EFP. So I do think there is some benefit to clarifying exactly what information the council would want to see and why the council would want to see it. If ultimately the goal of the applicant is to get a new fishery going.
Joe?
Yeah, sorry, I guess I wasn't clear. So I guess my question then is, if we made it clear that we would be something special, do you think GARFO would make that part of this particular approval, that information is collected and added to the report, or is that just, again, part of the wish list?
Mike?
So, yeah, I mean, so we do have the authority under our regs to put like terms and conditions on an EFP. We do, those are often tailored to the specific activity for a lot of different reasons. And so I could see where, we could suggest to the applicant that this information be included in the report at the request of the council.
Michelle?
And again, further up in the draft policy guidance document, whatever we're calling it, under step 2, which discusses, review by the SSC, one of those pieces is, provide information that may be equal to future stock assessments and management. So I think that SSC review would certainly inform what we might expect in a report from an applicant. Could potentially provide additional in the SSC review. That might be one of the ask the SSC to focus on in particular, is information that would be useful for determination of future management action.
Mike?
Yeah, I'm sorry to belabor this because it's going on longer than everybody thought, but I guess nothing against the SSC. The SSC took a look at the thread hearing EFP, the first version of it, which was 2 pages. And they said, sure, this seems fine. We don't have any concerns, but there's a lot of information we don't have. And it wasn't a terribly useful review or evaluation of the EFP application. And a lot of work has gone into it since then to address the concerns that the agency has raised on a number of issues. So I do think that may in part be because council didn't have real firm terms of reference for the SSC in terms of what they were looking for, what the council was looking for in terms of an SSC review. But I just raise it as a caution flag that we have to be I think we have to be pretty specific about what we're asking the SSC to do and not just expect that they're going to give us full scientific evaluation of the proposal. With red herring, we didn't get that.
Adam?
Given the discussion we've had so far, I'm prepared to make a motion for approving this with 2 specific changes to it. The specific changes that I would ask for would be a sentence as per what Michelle brought forward at the end of the policy goals section, detailing that this review is non-binding on the council or other language that staff thought was appropriate, and that the section starting on page 5 labeled EFP process for forage amendment EC species be renamed guidance for council review of EFP applications for forage amendment. So I would make a motion for approval of this document with the changes discussed today, where the scope of the changes was those 2 things I just put.
Chris Moore?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm a little concerned and confused about the discussion we're having. Concerned and confused because I thought that we had Garfield involved in the development of this document through our EOP committee. Basically, it agreed to everything that's in this document prior to the meeting today. At least so now I'm hearing a proposal to change titles, change some of the sentences, and that's tough to do at a meeting. Smith, make sure that everybody's on the same page. So what I would suggest, given that we do have some time, is that we wait. Bring this document back to the council in December, have you look at it again, after we have some additional EO, see if everyone agrees with title, content, and make sure we're on board with how we want to proceed. I just don't think we can do it besides that at this point. Julia, I'd ask you, is there any timing issue? Wait till December?
I don't think so. There was a previous discussion of the thread herring EFP is still in review, hasn't been determined that it's complete. And there was some discussion at I think it was at the committee meeting in the spring, that this new guidance or policy or process or whatever you want to call it would not apply to that EFP because it wouldn't necessarily be fair to the applicants that they got so far in the process, and then the guidance changed. Not that this is necessarily a big change from what the council previously wanted, but just the fact that that application review is already underway. There was some discussion of that we shouldn't, the council shouldn't kind of make sure this is finalized in time to incorporate it into the review of that application the council has already had, like was mentioned, SSC and also committee and AP review of that application. But beyond that, we don't have any indication of other EFP applications that are coming. It's possible, but I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a strict deadline on this if the understanding is that the intent is not to totally square this away before the red herring EFP can move forward.
Chris?
Thanks, Julia, for that. So given that, there's no rush. Again, I suggest we wait till December. Staff will have a conversation with the EOP committee chair, see if in fact we want to have another EOP
Certainly, we'll have some conversations with GARPO staff to see how best to address some of the concerns that were brought to the table today. I think we'll be in a better situation in December to vote on a document if, in fact, everyone agrees with that.
Everybody fine with moving this till December? I think by then we'll have we can have the new highlighted version of everything that we've got and that's going to be put into the document. And I think with that, we're going to punt it till December meeting. Julia, anything else to bring for us?
No, if we think that decision is fine without a motion or anything, then that's all that's needed.
All right, thank you very much. Run a little bit behind schedule. Let's start with let's go with our next item, offshore wind energy development. We're going to break this down into two parts. We'll start with Ursula Housen from Bohm. Then we'll go to Morgan from the New York Energy Research and Development Authority. And with New York, I'd like to say, hello, Captain Tony DeLernia. Glad to see you. Ursula, we are ready when you are.
Good. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thanks. I don't have a laptop with me, so I'm just gonna slides up there. So hi, everyone. My name is Ursula Housen. I am a biologist with the Office of Renewable Energy Programs. Actually, soon to be changing to a policy analyst, but I am covering for Brian Hooker this week. It's at a offshore wind conference in Boston. I imagine if you have, or if we have concerns that evolve from this conversation, he can probably touch on those in December at the next meeting. Okay. I think you have all seen this before. It is a updated frequently nowadays with our active projects. You can see probably the most important items are a little bit further down where it says construction and operation plans. Hopefully by now you're familiar with that term. The construction and operations plans are the documents that we do the analyses on, and those are the documents that are then, if the project is approved, those are the documents that receive a letter of approval, which is essentially a permit to proceed with the project. We have 18 POPs that have been submitted to BOEM so far. Records of decision have been issued for 4 of those in the last 2 years. We have 9 currently under review, and I'll be talking about some of those today. And we have 5 more POPs that have been submitted. So have some leasing under consideration, and I'll touch on those in the Mid-Atlantic today as well. We'll be going north to south in this case, so touching on Empire Wind at the north and then going down to Seaval and then the Central Atlantic wind energy areas. I also want to give a very brief update on the status of the fisheries mitigation guidance, and then a few environmental studies updates, one of which you might be particularly. So for Empire, the FEIS, the final environmental impact statement, again, that's our NEPA document on our construction and operations plans. That was just published in September, and we anticipate a record of decision on that project in November. I'll go through some of these very quickly, anticipating that if you have anything, of course, that you want to focus on, we'll get to those in the session. So NOI is a notice of intent, and we have the New York Bight programmatic environmental impact statement. NOI went out in July. We are currently working on that programmatic EIS, and that is to cover certain aspects of the projects in the New York Bight. So those are the recently leased areas offshore
in deeper water off of near site. The PEIS, again, that's the programmatic environmental impact statement, is anticipated in early 2024. We will have accompanying public meetings to go with that, the draft PEIS publication. Those will be virtual and in person, but we don't have that schedule yet. So hopefully by December or whenever the next council meeting is, we'll be able to provide you with that information. The final PEIS is late 2024. One thing of note is that it was determined with GARFO that the biological assessments, the National Marine Fisheries Service biological assessment and the EFH assessment will both be programmatic. So those consultations are currently underway. And for more information, and actually I should have mentioned this on the Empire slide as well, we have the link on there, but we also have the QR code. So if you're here, you can't access the link on the slide, you can just use the QR code to access any of the web pages. Okay, moving on to the south, we have Atlantic Shores. We have an Atlantic Shores South update, and that had a recent publication for the DEIS in May, this past May, and we had public meetings down in New Jersey, South Jersey in June. We had a couple of those. The FEIS, the final EIS, is due in February, and then we are anticipating a record of decision in March of next spring. For ocean wind, as I'm sure you're aware, we had the record of decision was in July, and that record of decision was to approve the project, and then the subsequent actual permit, in effect, it's the permit, that's the COP letter of approval, was issued in September. And I do want to point out, there was a little bit of talk in Catherine and John's presentation this morning at 9, some questions about lessee mitigation for federal surveys. So I do want to note that in order to see the terms and conditions for the COP letter of approval, to see what the developer is being held accountable for and will be provided to mitigate for the federal surveys, you can take a look at the link that I have there. You look for the COP letter of approval, and you'll look for condition numbers, I believe it's 6.3. And that condition defines what the developer is responsible for. And it is broad brush at this point in time, because don't know quite yet, as Catherine and John and Peter mentioned this morning, we don't know yet what that mitigation would look like. However, we worked very closely with that team, with John, with Catherine, especially. We have a team that's been stood up. It's called the Northeast Survey Mitigation Implementation Team. And we are trying to define with that team what that mitigation will look like. So what those developers will be responsible for, whether it is that they conduct the surveys and we ensure that the surveys are comparable to the federal surveys, or that they provide funding for NEFSC or another entity to carry out those surveys. That condition that is in the 6.3 I mentioned, that is in the terms and conditions, was developed very closely with that team. So with John, with Catherine, and a couple of other members, Andy Lipsky, and so on. So you know, if you have a chance, if you do want to ask questions about that at the end when I'm finished, please take a look at that now. And I apologize, I should have thought to have the condition on here, but I didn't know that that there would be questions about that this morning. Okay, so then moving on to Maryland offshore wind. So the DEIS was just published, or October 6th, actually, it is being published this week. The FEIS, we anticipate for June of next year, and then the record of decision is next July. Maryland offshore wind was previously known as U.S. wind, so you may be that that name. Okay. And then for CVAL, that's the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Commercial Lease. Remember, there's also that research lease that was approved years ago. So this is the commercial lease. The FEIS was just published this past Friday, and we anticipate the record of decision for the end of this month. For the Central Atlantic, I know there a number of people are especially interested in the Central Atlantic wind energy areas, or WEAs. The final WEAs were just published this summer, and they were pared down considerably. The original call area, as you can see from the lease areas up there, 3.9 million acres, and then the final WEAs are those in color. And those came down to a total of about 356,000 acres. The little pink area in B is still being discussed, so that has not been finalized. I believe there's some coordination with Department of Defense that is underway, determine if that lease area could still be implemented as a lease, or put out for auction as a lease. There will be a task force meeting for the public sale notice next week, so you can register at the link that I posted below. And we anticipate the environmental analysis. That's a different type of a document from an EIS, which I'll address in just 1 minute. And then the lease sale is anticipated in 2024. We don't have any firm dates yet on the lease sale. Regarding the EA, when we do environmental analysis on the leases, in order for those areas to be leased, they undergo a somewhat different review than the full environmental impact analysis, or EIS, that is done on the construction and operations plan. The EA is very limited. It only looks at site assessment and survey activities for those areas. So that is not just because an EA has been conducted, and if the EA then is finalized, that only gives the developers authority to conduct surveys on the lease area. It's very important that you understand that it does not give the developer the ability or the approval to actually build on those lease areas. They're only allowed to do investigative work at that point. It's just a quick update. A few of these slides that I'm going to be getting to just have some highlights on them, and those highlights are the updates. A couple of these are Brian's slides that he used in the June meeting, and we just wanted to add a little bit of information to those slides so that you're aware that this past summer, we completed the discussions with the tribal nations that had shown interest in the fisheries mitigation guidance, and the issuance of the final guidance is still to be determined, but there is development of that final guidance. It is moving forward, so we anticipate something. We don't know when, and Brian will provide a further update on that at the next meeting. Okay, and another update on our environmental studies program. So the ESP, we publish the studies development plan annually. It is for 2 years out, but it is published annually. Those study ideas are reviewed by COSA, which is a committee of the National Academies of Science, who provide oversight on all of our studies. And those studies are then used in BOEM's environmental analysis and decision-making processes. I just wanted to flag that we encourage the submission of any study ideas from agencies, organizations, just individuals. And that typically, that submission process takes place around November, December. You can look at that link that I posted on there in order to access to the website that provides you with that information. There may not be a link on there yet for submission of ideas because, you know, as I said, it is November, December, but do keep that in mind. We received some very thought out letters from fisheries organizations and use those to help us to determine what should be prioritized for the subsequent years funding. And so as an example of that, we have a new study that I can provide a little bit of information about now. We do have a flyer from the principal investigators that we were hoping to be able to provide today. It's not quite completed, but if the council would like, I can provide that in the next day or two to Julia, and that could be posted on the website. So this is a fishing industry spatial needs analysis, working with VIMS and Linker. And the goal of this is really to develop a better understanding of the potential and actual changes in relevant fishing activity as a result of offshore wind. And so the focus will be on Atlantic surf clam, ocean quahog, and Atlantic sea scallop. And the PIs will work with the Fisheries Knowledge Trust as well to get some of that information. That's running for the next 2 years, and we anticipate providing updates. I'm sure at the next meeting, I'm sure Brian will be providing an update on this and in subsequent meetings. The end result of this, the report would typically be provided a couple of months if it says August 2025. I'm not quite sure if the report would be available August 2025 or maybe just a little bit later. And just wanted to give an update, the highlighted portions of this slide, which was presented at the last meeting, which is a nature inclusive design study. And the purpose of that was to evaluate different materials that could be used for scour protection around the bases of turbines or potentially on cables as well that might need scour protection if they can't dug in to the substrate. And the first test materials were deployed this past summer. There were diver quadrat surveys as well as time-lapse camera monitoring. The field deployment will go between now and summer, this past summer, through the fall of next year, and then the final report will be due the following summer. Okay, and that is all I have today. Questions?
Thank you, Ursula. Any questions, comments? Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Ursula, for the presentation. Just a quick question with regard to the project, the very last project, the one on nature inclusive scour protection. So at the end of that study period, I assume the material will stay in there, like it's not going to be removed, or are there plans to remove it?
I would assume it would be removed. I think it's only in there for the testing. So there's a variety of different materials that are being used. I believe it's just in there for the testing. It's not actually acting as scour protection. I got it. I don't think that, there wouldn't have been any kind of like consultation done on it to allow, permanent placement of those. So that's what I assume. I could find out more if you want. Thank you.
Sonny Gwynn.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the presentation. A couple slides back, you were looking at the fisheries. The Thames was doing the surf clam, ocean quahog, Atlantic sea scallop. How about the other fisheries that participate in that area, like the conch fisheries, lobster, and
Excellent question, and I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't have enough information at this point. I just wanted to kind of give you guys a heads up. We do, as I said, we can provide that flyer with more information. What I believe is that it's just being focused at this point because, there's only so much funding available, and those were some FMPs that were of particular concern. I can, as I said, provide that flyer to you. I believe that Brian Hooker is we call it a contracting officer representative, which is basically the liaison between BOEM and that project. So I can provide, or I could let him know that there were some additional questions about that he could follow up on.
Skip Feller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, I was going to echo that with the Welks off of Virginia. And Bobby Rule might actually be able to shed some light, because I thought at one point they might have been involved with the survey of the Welks.
Okay, great. So we'll follow up on that then. Julie, we'll back with that.
Adam Nowalski.
Question about the nature inclusive design. The purpose is to test the effectiveness of different materials in promoting marine growth and enhancing habitat. Would the next logical conclusion to that be that BOEM would support and encourage those materials that do the best job at promoting marine growth and enhancing habitat?
It's an excellent question, and yes. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to fund a project like this. If you look at those terms and conditions that I mentioned for ocean wind, and for all of our other projects, we've worked with NIMS, with GARFO, to develop a term, condition, measure, a mitigation measure that is a requirement, like a special condition in the permit, that requires the developer to use, wherever possible, some kind of material for their scour protection that will promote epifaunal growth. The industry has not caught up yet on that, and a lot of those materials are not yet available. It would be helpful all around for us, for GARFO, and for the developer to be able to pinpoint specific materials that would be preferred over others. And then we can wrap that up into a condition, a requirement of COP approval. So they would have to use something like that, either something like that, or provide very, very good, very detailed justification why that would not be available, or why that wouldn't be used.
Adam.
So in the purpose of increasing epifaunal growth would also be to increase habitat for many of the species that we manage, such as summer flounder, black sea bass, correct? So I see you nodding the head. So the comment based on that if we're going to promote epifaunal growth that encourages species we manage to inhabit those areas, those fish have to come from somewhere. These lease areas are significantly farther offshore than where a lot of these fish are often found. Summer flounder inshore, black sea bass inshore, whatever the species are. And so we're going to be faced with the challenge of effectively the displacement of those species. And it's something we're going to have to contend with. Now, long term, the hope would be that promoting the epifaunal growth by providing more habitat would ultimately make these populations more robust. But that's a longer term goal than what we're going to have to consider in the short term. So I just bring that out there, hearing very specifically that we've got on the record, we're going to promote epifaunal growth. We expect species managed are going to inhabit them. We're then going to be faced with the challenge of those displacements.
Bobby Rule.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just to touch on what Skip Bella said, we are not involved in the well survey that Dominion is doing. I do know that they've partnered up with BIMS, and I'm not quite sure how far along they are with that, but we do participate in the Ocean Wind 1 sampling with Rutgers, but we don't have anything to do with the well study currently. And also to touch on what was just said, we are going to be facing an issue as far as how to properly manage and capture what's going to change. I mean, it's all speculation at this point, but trying to promote faunal growth and so forth and so on. And you know, you're 100% correct. You're going to be, the fish are going to come from somewhere. You're not going to just generate new fish. So it's almost a man-made shift in you know, smaller populations. You're going to be creating areas that were typically thoroughfares for different multitudes of species of fish that you're now going to introduce resident populations of certain species. The benefit of that, I mean, is to be seen. It could have, you know, it could be great, it could be bad, but it's from the management aspect and the data aspect, it's going to be really hard, in my mind, to figure out how to tackle that. Because, like I say, you're not creating more fish. You may have areas that production is better, and it very well could be a much more robust environment, but what that does to the overall population and the overall density of a broader area is yet to be seen. So I think there's a lot of unknowns with this, but you just kind of wait and see what the data shows, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Paul Reese.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to move a step further with Adam and Robert just said, a consideration of mine has been no matter what you put around these things, it's going to attract fish. And even moving towards including the cooperative commercial trawls to sample, they're not going to get on this stuff. So how are we going to look to not even looking at displacement of the fisheries, but these are fish that are going to be harder to count, which is going to start looking like a reduced biomass. So are we going to move towards pots and traps, and how do we even recalibrate that into what we've been doing for biomass estimates? Thank you.
Any more comments from around the table? Ursula.
Thanks. I just wanted to add, just going back to Adam's original comment. So, you know, there is, of course, the question of whether if a stock is robust enough, if it's producing an excess larvae, that if additional settlement opportunities are presented, that they would take advantage of that. Great question, great point all around. I believe we have a study, and I don't know enough about it at this point, and this is something else we can follow up on, that is looking at retention versus inshore migration of certain species, whether they're retained, you know, because I know that the concern, especially in New Jersey, is if they're offshore seasonally and then start moving inshore, will they stop at the turbines or keep going inshore? And I believe we have a study that's being developed about that, but I will follow up on that to see if we can provide some more information. And I also encourage, again, anyone with those concerns to please do submit study ideas, submit those comments, submit those ideas, so that that can help us to focus, if we don't already have a study on that, that can help us to focus our study funding on concerns like that.
Eric Reed.
So talk about larval disbursement. How many substations? Water? What's that going to do to larval?
Right. A good question. Right now, none of the projects that I presented have an open loop cooling, and I'll explain for those who may not be familiar. Open loop cooling is a cooling process used for HVDC cables. So the projects that we currently looked at today are AC, which are typically for projects that are closer to shore. The cables are a little bit different. They're AC cables. They don't get overheated the way DC cables are. For efficiency, electrical efficiency, projects that are further offshore, I think it's greater than 75 mile, transit of those or lengths of those cables from an offshore wind facility to the shore require HVDC. And so another requirement with HVDC, because they do produce some heat, is a cooling station. And what that cooling station is, it's offshore, and it uses an open loop, almost like a nuclear power plant would. So you have water coming in, it's a once through that cools the system, provides cooling to the cables somehow. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know all those details. And then there is a plume of warmer water that is released into the water column. And typically these are up in the water column. As I said, so far off of New Jersey, those projects I presented don't have them. There is one, I believe it's one of the Atlantic Shores projects, I think it's the north, that may be proposing that. We are seeing that in the southern, at least one southern New England, two southern New England projects. One is Sunrise Wind. And that process, in order to analyze potential impacts to larval fish that could be, and phytoplankton, zooplankton, and ichthyoplankton that would move through that system, there is a full analysis done on the quantification of the larvae, typically using Ecomon data. The larvae that could potentially move through that volume of water and could potentially be entrained into or lost completely into that system. If they're moving through the system and they're larvae, they will be lost. You know, that's small. If they're entrained, not going to survive. That process is permitted by the EPA. So they have to go through a, I don't know what the acronym stands for. It's NPS. We call it a NIPDES permit. So that is permitted through the EPA. It's also evaluated through the EFH consultation and the ESA consultations in the projects. So those are underway right now with Sunrise Wind. And so of course, since that's above the Mid-Atlantic, I don't have that on there. But if you'd like, I can provide to Julia a link to that website, our BOEM website for Sunrise Wind, where you can look at the ichthyoplankton analysis report, you can look at the NIPDES permit, you can look at the consultation and so on. And those standards are what will be used for subsequent projects as well. What's your?
Go ahead, Eric.
Follow up. Can you remind me of how many million gallons?
I don't know offhand, unfortunately. It would be in those reports. If you'd like, we can have a report on that for the next meeting. Would that be helpful? Or again, I can point everyone to the permit application, the plankton report, and the EFH assessment. I just can't pull those numbers out right now. I do know that the comparison, it is less than the inshore nuclear power plants and so on.
See, I don't want to see anything already. It's millions of multiplied by however many, a lot of water. Thank you for your answer.
Sure, and if you don't want to read anything from BOEM, there is that EPA document, which I think would be helpful, so.
Questions from the audience? Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp-Seafries. I have a two-part question. The first part is, can you give me an example of any situation where BOEM would disapprove a COP?
I can't because I'm not a decision maker. So I think that is a question best left for a decision maker. There's always that possibility that they could approve, disapprove with modifications, or disapprove completely a project. But I'm at the lower level, so I don't get involved in those decisions.
So my second question is, as part of the review process, when you are reviewing various aspects of the project, comments, information, et cetera, does BOEM have in its process a threshold where a certain level of environmental impacts or user conflict impacts, like a threshold that would say, okay, this is too much and the project would get disapproved? Is that in your process?
Not, again, unfortunately, and I'm sorry, I can't give you more information at this point, but not at my level. So my job and my colleagues like Brian and others, we are in the environmental analysis section. So what we do is make sure that the NEPA documents, so, you know, the National Environmental Policy Act documents, are as complete and thorough as possible. There's no decision that comes out of that document. There is a preferred alternative, but that doesn't have to be the final decision. And then that and all the information, like you said, about conflicts and so on, are presented to the decision maker, and they're the ones who ultimately make the decision.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I would just like to take this opportunity to explain a few things to the council. Not that you don't already see this in action. However, I read the actual DEISs, I read the NEPA documents, I read the FEISs documents, et cetera. There is no level of impact where BOEM will disapprove a project. But what it will do in its NEPA review, last June, BOEM published, not in the Federal Register, but just on their webpage, and made an announcement, a NEPA standardization process. And if you read that document, BOEM says that all of its NEPA analysis, or all of its alternatives that it will consider putting in its DEISs, are screened according to this document. The considerations are the executive order to tackle the climate crisis, state power purchase agreements, the developer goals, and state renewable energy mandates. And if an alternative, for example, an alternative that would avoid fisheries impacts, don't meet those things, that alternative is automatically screened out and never makes it into the NEPA document. And essentially, so what we have is, from the day that a lease is issued, it is a done deal. I can say from personal experience, for example, the Empire Wind FEIS was recently released. I engaged extensively with BOEM prior to that area even being leased, prior to the EA, prior to the proposed sale notice. Gave a lot of information from the squid fishery. I know the scallop fishery did the same. And I was at a New York task force meeting with NYSERDA, with BOEM, and various other DOI and state officials, where the director of BOEM began the meeting, and this is prior to the lease sale, saying, "I'm not a marine biologist, but I'm a history maker," and proceeded to say how they would make history with the first offshore wind farm off of the state of New York. And I will read one more thing very briefly from the Empire Wind final EIS. It says, BOEM and NREL independently reviewed Empire's analysis, and based on this review determined that alternative E, which would have made a small no-build zone to allow for commercial fishing transit through the project, would not allow Empire to install the minimum number of wind turbines necessary to fulfill Empire's contractual obligations with NYSERDA. So it was not their preferred alternative, because prior to NEPA review, the developer signs a power purchase agreement with a state utility or agency like NYSERDA. And as long as that power purchase agreement is in prior to the COP being submitted for environmental review, it is a done deal, and it is going through. It will get approved by the agency. And I have some more comments that I will reserve for afterwards, after Morgan's presentation, but I think that is something that folks need to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. We're running out of time, running behind time here. So let's go ahead and start with the second half of the presentation. Morgan from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. You can probably stay there if you want.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Morgan Brumbauer. I'm the Offshore Wind Marine Fisheries Manager for NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. NYSERDA is a non-regulatory authority for New York State, which is tasked at implementing New York's energy policy. I sit within our environmental research team, and we're responsible for collecting data, doing research to provide to the policymakers in New York State to help inform their decision making. So I'm going to walk us back to where we are today, to how we got here, and then talk a little bit about New York's process moving forward. So as we can see on this figure, East Coast goals are quite large. There's also federal goals out there that are quite large. And these goals often change and have been changing and probably will change in the future as states look to their energy policies and look to decarbonize and electrify different components within their state. So again, just wanted to throw up a figure here of areas around New York, including southern New England and the northern part of the lease areas for the Mid-Atlantic. And this is just a figure to depict what areas have been currently leased, where projects are procured from, who is procuring them, and what areas are currently left in the fight. And this is important to recognize as we look forward, as the states try to achieve those goals that I showed in. So just a reminder on New York State's offshore wind goals. Back in 2019, New York State signed into law the Climate Act, which mandated 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. And also established the Climate Action Council, which currently released its planning document or scoping plan, suggesting that in order for New York to meet its electrification and decarbonization goals, the likely goal for New York State would have to be between 16 and 18 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. So as I mentioned before, states are going through many of these internal scoping plans and processes in order to evaluate where their current goals are for offshore wind and where their current goals may need to be. Many of these scoping plans, it also often outlines terrestrial wind, hydro, nuclear power, and solar power as well. So if we take a step back a little bit further, released in 2018, New York State released its first offshore wind master plan, which set the stage for how the state would meet its goal at that time, which was 2.4 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030. It also established our technical working groups, which are groups where we bring stakeholders and developers together to try to address or identify challenging topics. We have one for the fisheries, we have one for environmental justice, maritime, jobs and supply chain. And the goal of this plan was to identify kind of the most favorable areas of potential offshore wind energy, describe economic and environmental benefits, understand the impacts of offshore wind development, address mechanisms for how to procure offshore wind energy in the state of New York, as well as an analysis of costs, cost reduction pathways, and identify kind of workforce opportunities and supply chain needs. So this is just a depiction of the 20 studies that were included as part of Master Plan 1.0. There are several environmental studies as well as studies on workforce development, studies on cabling, viewshed issues, and cost reduction measures. As a reminder, this is the area of the first master plan. In total, there were over 16,700 square miles that were analyzed as part of the the nearshore space, and it went as far offshore as the 60-meter contour. At the time, that was kind of the technical limitations of offshore wind, so New York State used that as the boundary. So now, where are we now? So if you look at this figure, it's a kind of a timeline of the release of the master plan 1.0 and kind of the subsequent procurement opportunities that New York had released. And if we look at the time it took from master plan 1.0, time that we had the New York lease auction by BOEM, that's roughly a 5-year time period. And if you actually go before the master plan, roughly 2 years to do those studies, review those studies, and come up with the master plan. So in total, it's probably about 7 years from when you start planning efforts, run the studies, to when BOEM would then start their process, go through their process to the final lease auction. So if we look at that, and we look at the goals that the states have from across the region, across the coast, how fast energy is procured from those lease areas, it is likely that we will need more lease areas in the New York Bight. So in order to start that process, New York has begun what we call our Master Plan 2.0 deep water process in order to start those conversations to have a baseline understanding of what is likely to come in areas deeper than the 60 contour. The reason we're starting it now is, as I said, it likely is going to take about 4 to 5 years plus to get to a lease area. We want to have those conversations early, often, and include that feedback as part of that value add to improve the BOEM process. So if we look at the Master Plan 2.0 main objectives, there are several. That includes organizing the offshore wind work in a robust, strategic, and transparent manner to achieve New York State's current offshore wind goals as well as those into the future, to continue to be proactive and inclusive of stakeholder input in our decision making, and that's early and often and throughout our process. And then again, to characterize the risks and opportunities for sequential and logical development. So if we look at the area of analysis, as we are calling it in the offshore space, we decided to choose quite a large area, knowing that the resources that utilize the space and resource utilizers in the offshore space are not just from New York, but from across the region. So to understand the offshore environment, we really needed to be a little bit more inclusive of the space. And this is not to say that New York is advocating for development across all 3 of those zones or any one particular zone, but in order to understand that space, we thought it was prudent to include such a wide and expansive set of zones. So the first zone extends from the 60-meter contour, goes to the out to the 150-meter contour, and is approximately 12,000 square miles. Zone 2 goes from the 150-meter contour to roughly 2,000 meter contour, and is approximately 6,800 square miles. Excuse me. Zone 3 extends out past the shelf break to the 3,000-meter contour and is approximately 16,800 square kilometers. What's important to note about this area is that since it's past that 60-meter contour, the majority of this area, if it were to be developed, would be floating offshore wind, which would be a new technology consideration for Mid-Atlantic. Again, here's a set of the initial studies that NYSERDA is currently in the process of drafting and finalizing by the end of the year. The main goals are to understand the marine resources present as well as the resource users in the area of analysis, update knowledge and of stressors and resources and review novel stressors related to offshore wind. This is a new consideration from Master Plan 1.0. We are also looking to define data gaps and uncertainties and the limitations of the current publicly available data and highlight those uncertainties and recommendations of how to address and advance the need for addressing those data gaps. We're also updating kind of mitigation guidance about what might be needed in order to address some of these challenges or issues. And then identify areas of further research to better understand the area of analysis, which is important as we look to either advancing offshore wind in this space or removing areas. Again, the timeline of where we were and where we're going. So early spring and throughout the summer, there were data gathering exercises, literature reviews. We included a project advisory committee for each one of the studies. Those project advisory committees were utilized to help address the data needs in order to understand this area. We also utilized our technical working groups, provide feedback on the data needs or the data gaps, and throughout the summer released the draft reports to our technical working groups and our project advisory committees to provide feedback on those draft reports, provide information on accuracy or completeness. Again, this is meant to be a baseline understanding of the space, so we may not have all of the answers, but we can certainly highlight the needs to address some of the data gaps or the uncertainty. We're right now in the process of finalizing these reports for internal review by the end of October and hope to have a public version of the reports by the end of the year. We are also looking to include recommendations to BOEM by the end of this year or early next year about the findings and the feedback that we have gotten from our stakeholders. In addition to that, starting late this year and into next year, we will have several additional studies that we will be trying to fund. We're right now in the process of scoping these different studies, and these will also be included in our future recommendations to better improve the BOEM process. Thank you for your time. Happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Morgan. Any questions, comments around the table? Anyone, any questions in the audience? Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapsey-Fries. Morgan, or whoever's doing the slides, could you go back to the New York offshore wind goals slide towards the beginning? That one, yes. Thank you. I just want to flag something to the council. As council, you know, I know has staff that participates in the NYSERDA FTWIG process and things like that. Currently, New York's stated goal is 9 gigawatts, right? But if you look at the second yellow lettering on the slide right there, it says that their Climate Action Council scoping plan suggests 16 to 18 gigawatts of offshore wind energy may be necessary to ensure New York State achieves its Climate Act mandate. So that means double what's currently getting planned, right? So what I, as an FTWIG, requested, I would suggest that the council request the same, is we're talking very big numbers here. And what ends up happening is that everything gets segmented into individual projects kind of here and there. I think it's very important to take a holistic view of what's really being proposed at the outset. So I requested, you know, based on kind of what's being done fairly standardly now with a turbine in roughly a mile every direction, if that turbine is 12 to 15 megawatts, how many thousands of square miles are we talking about to achieve 18 gigawatts of power? Like, what's the total land mass or ocean mass that we're looking at putting windmills on? And I think that that type of conversation is very important. It has not been done at the BOEM level. It has also not been done really at a state by state level when you add all the state goals together. But I think it's going to be very important for this council to look at how much of the federal ocean that this council manages is going to be needed to achieve all these things. Because that type of cumulative impact, I think people really need to start getting it in their heads now. Thank you.
Let's go online. James Fletcher.
For the previous speaker, I had two questions. One, where does the Navy and Defense Department lie in creating an area where foreign submarines can lay with no detection? When you go into these situations, it'll be almost impossible to detect them. The second question is as I mentioned earlier, doing an electronic survey, much like is in the fresh water, who do I contact with Bowen to find out where they are? But for the council, could the council request that Bowen develop an electronic survey method in conjunction with the Northeast Science Center? One simple statement: develop an electronic survey for the marine life using whatever Northeast Science Center technology. Thank you.
Ursula.
Thank you. So I will try to address your first question first, which is about the Department of Defense. So BOEM coordinates with the Department of Defense Clearinghouse, which is an organization that compiles all of the information from all of the armed services in terms of usage and conflicts on the Outer Continental Shelf. And I don't know if we can bring my slides back up again, but if you have them handy on your laptops, you can take a look at the Central Atlantic leasing area that I had shown you was reduced from something like 3.6 million acres down to 300,000 acres. And a lot of that was DoD usage. So the Department of Defense came in recently, contacted BOEM, and recommended that a lot of that area be withdrawn because of Department of Defense usage. And the section, the small pink polygon, I think it was in B, that I had mentioned, also was still in discussion with Department of Defense. So they are required, BOEM is required to consult with the Department of Defense again, and they do. And the Department of Defense is very clear about what areas need to be removed from consideration. So hopefully that answered your question. And then the second one regarding surveys, I'm not quite sure I understood it, but let me provide an answer, and then if this doesn't address it, please clarify. So the developers are required to do very specific types of surveys to characterize their lease areas, including side scan, multi-beam echo sounder, bathymetric, and so on. And those are the surveys that, to my knowledge, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center does not conduct, because Northeast Fisheries Science Center conducts primarily a fisheries focus and ecosystem focus, whereas the developer not only has to provide that information, but also information regarding the seafloor for engineering purposes, for cultural resources purposes, to identify archaeological artifacts that might be on the seafloor, tribal concerns in terms of ancient landforms that were part of the pre-contact culture and so on. So it probably would not be appropriate to try to ensure that those surveys are either done by Northeast Fisheries Science Center or comparable to what they're doing. So does that answer your question?
No, it doesn't, because the technology exists to use electricity to survey in fresh water from the top to the bottom. Smith Root, which I shouldn't use their name, says that it would be extremely hard or almost impractical to do it in salt water. But if Bowen has the best experts in the world on electricity, if the council mandated that Bowen and the wind developers develop a method to survey from the top to the bottom, would Bowen be required to do it? Not ask, but mandate. The council mandate that there be a survey method. Then, from that survey method, the commercial fishing industry could work off of it and be able to harvest fish in these areas where we're going to be excluded from using trawls and nets and the traditional methods of fishing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I believe that that would be out of BOEM's purview. BOEM, the electrical component that BOEM specifically works with is really just looking at the transmission cables and the power capability of those turbines. We don't have electrical experts per se on staff. We have engineers that can analyze the capacity of cables and the capacity of those turbines and ensure that the engineering that's being proposed is appropriate. There is another agency, in the Department of Energy, that looks at actual power production and things like that. But I think none of that would serve to enable any kind of, I guess, capacity building in using electricity in fishery surveys. I definitely think that would be out of BOEM's purview.
All right, we're running low on time, so Julie Evans, if you have one quick short question, we're going to wrap this up at 12:30.
I don't have one quick short question, unfortunately, because I've been waiting for half hour to ask a question. Who are the decision makers at BOEM? I mean, we talk about decision makers through this whole period, but who are the actual decision makers besides the Department of Interior, the Department of Commerce, perhaps, but who are the people that are signing off on these projects? That's one question. The second question is for Morgan, who I know, and since I represent the East Hampton Town fishing community, and we are the largest port as far as number of boats and also as far as finances go. Why haven't you contacted us with all these plans, and why aren't we participating in your NYSERDA project? And I guess that's all the time I will have.
To address the first question, Elizabeth Klein is currently the BOEM director, and she is typically the decision maker on offshore wind projects. She is we are within the Department of Interior, but the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is one agency within the Department of Interior.
And Morgan, would you like to answer the second question?
Sure. To address your second question, we do have members from across the region, fisheries members, not just New York, but in New York specifically. We have members on the technical working group from Greenport, from Montauk, and from Shinnecock. We also have conversations with fishermen on a one-on-one basis across the region and within East Hampton throughout many different opportunities, but always welcome to engage others if you're interested in the process. And just to address Megan's very poignant comment, this is not just a New York thing. We see other states from across the region looking at increasing their goals. As Megan points out, the area that is needed would likely be different because it is floating. and the technology is different. So those are all considerations and caveats that need to be evaluated and kind of brought to light now. So if there are kind of technological considerations that need to be made, whether that be for anchoring or mooring or inter-array cabling, those engineering considerations often take a long time to change. And if we do not have those conversations early, the likelihood is of any of those changes being made pretty slim. So just everyone who's not from New York, go back and talk to your folks who are involved in this process. Thank you.
Tony, I'm going to give you 30 seconds or so. Let's see if you can do it in 30
I'll
seconds.
very quickly to the last to the person from East Hampton asked the question. My name's Tony Delarnay. You all know me. I'm a former council member. Currently the liaison from NYSERDA to the recreational and the boating community in New York. But my work has taken me from basically Chatham to Cape May. I have spent just in the east end of Long Island alone, I've visited hundreds of locations, both bait and tackle shops and marinas, and I've distributed literature regarding the offshore wind projects. All the literature is neither promoting nor working against the projects, but simply it's informational. And that information has been all out there. It's been distributed to marinas, bait and tackle shops. On top of that, I am my phone number's there, my email address is there. I've spoken to fishing clubs, to chambers of commerce, and so the information is available. The only thing anyone has to do is just pick up the phone and send an email request, and I'll be there to answer questions. Again, not to promote for or against, but simply to inform the public of the work that's being done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ursula. Thank you, Morgan. And with that, we're going to break for lunch now. We'll come back at an odd time. Let's come back at 1:35 so we can get started again. Give us an hour. All right, see you guys in a little bit.